The night air over Europe feels heavy, as though centuries of secrets still drift among the stones of castles and palaces. The lights that shine today in Buckingham Palace, in Madrid's royal residence, or in the grand houses of Vienna are not just tourist attractions or ceremonial monuments. They are living reminders of something more enduring than governments, more powerful than parliaments, and more ancient than nations. Behind those walls, the story of bloodlines continues. Bloodlines that once wore crowns, commanded armies, and signed decrees that changed the course of the world. To believe that their power vanished with revolutions and constitutions is to believe that shadows do not exist when the sun goes down. The crowns may have been lifted from their heads, but the blood, the true inheritance of power, still flows. Europe today presents itself as modern, democratic, ruled by elected leaders, and responsive to public will. Presidents, prime ministers, and parliaments claim authority. Yet beneath the visible surface lies a hidden layer of history, one that refuses to fade. Walk the streets of London, and the face of a monarch still marks the currency. Step into Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, or Monaco, and the ruling families are not relics of history, but flesh-and-blood sovereigns, quietly shaping the destinies of nations. Even in countries where the crown has officially been broken, the families who once wore it have not disappeared. They have adapted, they have hidden, and they have endured. Imagine the scene, a dimly lit hall where chandeliers reflect off polished marble, portraits of long-dead kings and queens staring down with painted eyes. At the far end of the room, an heir of that line sits at a desk, signing documents or arranging marriages that will bind fortunes together for another generation. The world outside sees a philanthropist, a business magnate, perhaps even a politician. But in truth, this is not simply a man or woman of influence. This is the living continuation of an ancient dynasty, a bloodline carefully preserved through war, plague, and revolution. Their crown may not rest on their head, but it hovers invisibly above them, an inheritance of power that can never truly be dissolved. For most of history, Europe was not governed by the will of the people, but by the veins of the few. Kings and queens claimed divine right, insisting that their rule was sanctified by God himself. But in truth, their greatest weapon was not divine favor, but blood itself, the interwoven threads of families that stretched across borders and centuries. Marriage was not romance, but strategy. Every union was a treaty, every child a political pawn, every heir a potential ruler of kingdoms yet unconquered. This system created a network so vast and so interconnected that, by the dawn of the 20th century, nearly every royal house of Europe was related by blood. And yet, revolutions came. Thrones were toppled, crowns stolen, monarchs executed or exiled. The French Revolution ended with guillotines, the Russian Revolution with gunshots and abasement, the German and Austrian empires with abdications signed under duress. To the people, it seemed as though history itself had shifted, as though a new world had emerged in which the Age of Kings was over forever. But history has a cruel habit of hiding its truths in plain sight. The monarchs may have fallen, but their descendants lived on. Some escaped with jewels sewn into their clothes, others with fortunes smuggled through banks, still others with nothing but their name, a name that, even without a throne, still carried immense weight. Today, their presence is subtle, almost invisible to the casual observer. They appear at charity galas, at weddings covered by glossy magazines, at funerals where entire dynasties gather under the guise of mourning. But look closer, and patterns emerge. The same families who once crowned emperors now control financial networks. Descendants of fallen monarchs sit on corporate boards, influence diplomatic decisions, and marry into wealthy industrial families. The titles may be ceremonial, but the connections are not. The true legacy of royalty was never only in palaces or armies. It was in the weaving of a web so intricate that centuries of upheaval could not destroy it. This raises the question, who truly rules Europe today? Is it the prime minister who serves at the mercy of elections every few years? Or is it the families whose bloodlines stretch back 1,000 years, who have survived empire after empire, and who still remain when governments rise and fall? Power, after all, does not always wear a crown. Sometimes it wears a suit, signs a contract, or arranges a discreet dinner between aristocrats and politicians. Sometimes it hides behind philanthropy, behind foundations, behind smiling photographs of seemingly ceremonial figures who wave from balconies but whisper instructions behind closed doors. There is something haunting in this continuity. Imagine the Romanovs, shot in a basement in 1918, yet today descendants of that line live quietly in Europe and America. Imagine the Bourbons of France, whose guillotine was supposed to end their claim, yet their heirs still gather, still speak of their lost throne, still recognized by monarchist circles as the rightful rulers of France. Imagine the Habsburgs, who once ruled half of Europe, now scattered across palaces, villas, and political offices, their name alone carrying a weight that history textbooks cannot erase. These are not ghosts. They are men and women who live among us, descendants of kings, heirs to legacies of conquest and betrayal. And perhaps most striking of all is the survival of the British royal family. Their crown still shines in public, their monarchy still intact, though its form has shifted into something symbolic. Yet behind the symbolism lies immense power. Landholdings across the globe, investments, influence over politics that official accounts never fully reveal. The Windsors are the most visible of Europe's dynasties, but they are far from the only ones. Their cousins, their distant relatives, their fellow bloodlines still thrive in quieter corners of the continent. As this story unfolds, we will trace the hidden threads that bind Europe together. We will step into the halls of power where marriages were plotted, where treaties were sealed with kisses, where crowns were exchanged not by conquest but by inheritance. We will uncover the tragedies of those who lost everything and the cunning of those who preserved their legacies against impossible odds. And we will return, finally, to our own time, where these bloodlines still exist, still influence, still matter in ways the modern world often refuses to acknowledge. This is not merely history. It is a secret history that has never truly ended. Europe may present itself as democratic and modern, but behind the facades of parliament buildings and government offices, behind the names of presidents and prime ministers, lies something older, quieter, and far more enduring. The hidden kings of Europe are not gone. They are still here, watching from the shadows, their crowns invisible but their power undiminished. The question that remains, and the one that will guide us through this journey, is simple yet unsettling. If bloodlines have outlasted revolutions, wars, and centuries of change, then perhaps they are not just relics of history. Perhaps they are still the secret rulers of the present. And if that is true, what else remains hidden in the shadows? To understand how the hidden kings of Europe still hold influence today, we must journey back to the beginning, to the time when blood itself became the currency of power. In the early centuries of Europe's history, long before modern nations took shape, authority was not written in constitutions or voted into office. It was carried in blood, whispered in genealogies, and declared through the sacred ritual of succession. Kingship was not merely a role. It was an inheritance, a belief that the right to rule flowed through veins as surely as rivers carve valleys through stone. The first rulers were often warlords or tribal leaders. Their authority came from strength in battle, from the loyalty of warriors, and from the protection they offered to their people. Yet over time, raw power was not enough. People sought order, legitimacy, and the promise that their leader was chosen by more than just the sword. Thus was born the concept of divine right, the claim that kings ruled not because they were the strongest, but because the heavens themselves had set them above all others. This idea transformed fragile war bands into kingdoms and mere men into something more, chosen vessels of destiny. As Christianity spread across Europe, it sanctified this belief. The Church anointed monarchs with holy oils, crowning them not only as political leaders, but as semi-sacred figures. A king's blood was not ordinary blood. It was touched by God, and to shed it was to commit sacrilege. This sacred aura elevated families into dynasties. Once a man was crowned, his children, his grandchildren, and his descendants for generations would inherit that divine mantle. And so began the obsession with preserving lineage, an obsession that would shape the destiny of an entire continent. But bloodlines had to be protected. If the legitimacy of a ruler came from family, then the family had to be carefully guarded, its connections strengthened, its alliances expanded. Marriage became the most powerful weapon in the arsenal of kings. To marry one's daughter to a neighboring prince was to secure peace, wealth, or military strength. To wed one's son to the heiress of a foreign throne was to lay claim to another kingdom entirely. Through unions rather than battles, Europe's map was redrawn countless times. It is difficult to overstate how much weight blood carried in this world. Consider the medieval practice of heraldry, where coats of arms displayed a family's history, alliances, and claims. These symbols were not mere decorations, but declarations of legitimacy, visual proof of a lineage stretching back through generations. A crest carved above a castle gate was a silent proclamation. This family has ruled, and it shall continue to rule. To be born into the right bloodline was to inherit not only land and wealth, but the expectation of destiny itself. Yet destiny was fragile. Death in battle, sudden illness, or infertility could shatter dynasties. Europe's history is full of crises where a king left no clear heir, sparking wars of succession that tore nations apart. The 100 Years' War between England and France began not because of conquest, but because of disputed blood, rival claims to the French throne. In these moments, the supposed sanctity of lineage became a curse, for rival branches of the same family would spill oceans of blood to prove their legitimacy. The Church played a double-edged role in this system. On one hand, it strengthened dynasties by sanctifying marriages and reinforcing divine right. On the other, it created restrictions that forced families into dangerous patterns. The prohibition against marrying too close a relative forced kings to look abroad for spouses, weaving Europe's royal houses into an ever-tighter web of intermarriage. By the High Middle Ages, nearly every noble family of note was connected through one marriage or another, a vast, entangled tree whose roots fed the entire continent. And yet, beneath this web of holy sanction and noble tradition lay something far more human: ambition. Kings and queens were not saints. They lied, schemed, and betrayed. Marriages were annulled, alliances broken, bastards legitimized when convenient. The obsession with bloodlines created both stability and chaos. Stability in that dynasties could endure for centuries, chaos in that when a line faltered, entire nations collapsed into war. By the dawn of the Renaissance, bloodlines had become a weapon more potent than any army. Families like the Valois, the Tudors, and eventually the Habsburgs would rise to astonishing power not because they conquered with steel, but because they manipulated blood like master strategists. The king's bedchamber became as important as the battlefield, and the outcome of a marriage could decide the fate of millions. The emotional cost of this system was immense. Royal children were pawns long before they could speak. A young princess of 10 might be promised to a foreign prince she had never met. Her life mapped out in treaties signed before she even left her nursery. A young prince might grow up knowing that his worth was not measured in character or deeds, but in whether he could sire heirs to continue the dynasty. Love was a luxury, often sacrificed on the altar of blood. Yet the people themselves often believed in these bloodlines with fierce devotion. Subjects would kneel before their monarch, not just out of fear, but out of genuine awe. They believed that in the veins of their king ran something holy, something beyond ordinary humanity. The survival of that bloodline was the survival of the realm itself. To kill a king was to unbalance the world, to invite divine wrath. This belief, whether superstition or manipulation, gave dynasties immense resilience. Even in times of famine, rebellion, or plague, the crown endured, because the people clung to the idea that blood could not lie. And so the stage was set for Europe's most powerful families. Through the centuries, through wars and treaties, through births and deaths, blood became the invisible thread binding nations together. It was the root from which kingship grew, the unspoken law stronger than any written code. The birth of bloodlines was not a single event, but a slow transformation, a centuries-long weaving of destiny, faith, and ambition that turned fragile men into immortal dynasties. This was the soil in which the great houses of Europe took root. Soon, one family would rise above the rest, perfecting the art of bloodline power to such a degree that their reach would stretch across continents and centuries. Their name would become synonymous with crowns, their marriages with empires. They were the architects of dynastic strategy, and their legacy would change Europe forever. And so, with the birth of bloodlines established, we turn now to the family that crowned Europe itself, the dynasty that built an empire not with the sword, but with the altar. If the birth of bloodlines was the soil from which Europe's monarchies grew, then the Habsburgs were the towering oak tree, stretching their branches across the continent until nearly every crown rested in their shadow. Their story is not one of battlefield conquest or military genius. Instead, it is the story of marriages, alliances, and a patience so cold and calculating that it reshaped the very fabric of Europe. Where others fought, the Habsburgs wed. Where others conquered, the Habsburgs inherited. And in the end, it was not swords but signatures that made them the most powerful family on earth. The Habsburg name first emerged in the 11th century, tied to a modest castle in what is now Switzerland. At first, they were little more than local counts, holding small lands and modest influence. But ambition ran deep in their blood. They understood something that most families did not, that blood was stronger than steel, and that the throne of a kingdom could be won not on the battlefield, but in the marriage bed. It was this philosophy that would carry them from provincial lords to emperors of a realm so vast it seemed limitless. A single marriage in 1273 set the stage for everything to come. Rudolph of Habsburg, a relatively minor noble, was unexpectedly elected king of the Romans, the title given to the head of the Holy Roman Empire. This moment transformed the Habsburgs from obscurity to prominence, placing them at the very heart of European politics. From then on, the family pursued one goal with relentless precision: to secure and expand their influence through carefully arranged unions. The strategy was simple, but devastatingly effective. Marry into power, inherit through patience, and when necessary, outlast rivals. The Habsburg motto, whispered half in jest and half in awe, became famous across Europe. Bella gerent alii, tu felix Austria nube. Let others wage war. You, fortunate Austria, marry. And marry they did, until the map of Europe began to resemble a family tree with Habsburg roots entwined everywhere. One of their most famous unions was with the Duchy of Burgundy in the 15th century. Through marriage, the Habsburgs gained one of the wealthiest and most powerful territories in Europe, bringing them face to face with France in an ongoing rivalry that would shape centuries of conflict. Soon after, another marriage linked them to Spain, creating an empire so vast that it was said the sun never set on Habsburg lands. From Madrid to Vienna, from the Low Countries to the New World, the Habsburgs reigned over a dominion unlike any seen before. Perhaps the greatest triumph of Habsburg strategy came with Charles V. Inheriting Spain, Austria, the Low Countries, and vast overseas colonies, he became the most powerful man in Christendom. Crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 1519, his rule stretched from the Americas to Asia. Yet even Charles was not the product of conquest alone. He was the child of generations of marriages designed to consolidate power, the living embodiment of centuries of patient dynastic weaving. But the Habsburgs paid a price for their strategy. To secure their legacy, they often married close relatives, repeating alliances between cousins, uncles, and nieces. The result was a lineage both powerful and fragile, carrying within it the seeds of genetic decline. By the 17th century, Habsburg rulers bore the physical marks of this inbreeding. The infamous Habsburg jaw, a protruding chin and misshapen face that became a grotesque symbol of their obsession with keeping power within the family. Charles II of Spain, the tragic end of the Spanish Habsburg line, was so deformed and sickly that he could barely rule, his body collapsing under the weight of centuries of dynastic manipulation. And yet, even as their bloodline weakened, their influence remained staggering. Few families in history have held so many thrones simultaneously. At one point, the Habsburgs sat on the thrones of Spain, Portugal, Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, Croatia, Naples, Milan, and the Holy Roman Empire. They dictated the politics of Europe, determined the outcomes of wars, and controlled trade routes that spanned oceans. Their alliances made them unassailable, for to attack one Habsburg crown was often to provoke a dozen more. But what made the Habsburgs truly terrifying was not just their power, but their patience. They understood the long game of history. They did not need to win every war, for wars ended. They needed only to survive, to keep their bloodline intact, to wait for thrones to fall vacant and inheritances to come due. Time itself was their ally. Generations were their battlefield. And over centuries, this patience built an empire greater than any single conqueror could imagine. Yet this empire was not invincible. The very web of alliances that had made the Habsburgs powerful also made them vulnerable. The sheer scale of their dominion stretched them thin, embroiling them in endless conflicts. Religious wars, peasant uprisings, rival dynasties, and the ambitions of France all chipped away at their power. By the 18th century, their grip had weakened, and by the 19th, the once mighty Habsburg Empire was a patchwork of struggling territories, kept alive by inertia more than strength. Still, the legacy of the Habsburgs cannot be erased. They did what no sword ever could. They rewrote Europe through bloodlines. They proved that the most powerful throne is not the one seized in victory, but the one inherited through patience. Their descendants still walk among us, some holding titles, others living quietly, their names echoes of a dynasty that once crowned Europe itself. In many ways, the story of the Habsburgs is the story of Europe itself. Ambition, strategy, faith, and tragedy bound together in a web that spanned centuries. They were the ultimate architects of dynastic power, the family that proved marriage could be more potent than war, and that blood, once sanctified, could redraw the map of the world. But as we will see, their triumph was not without cost. The very obsession that made them great, the preservation of bloodlines, also led to their slow decline. Their power peaked with Charles V, but their legacy remained haunted by the shadow of inheritance gone too far. And so we leave the grandeur of the Habsburgs with a question. If bloodlines could crown empires, what happens when those same bloodlines begin to collapse under their own weight? The answer lies in the curse of inheritance, the hidden cost of dynastic power that would bring even the greatest families to their knees. The Habsburgs had mastered the art of dynastic strategy. They had proved that thrones could be won not with armies, but with marriages, not with bloodshed, but with bloodlines. Yet the very weapon that had carried them to the heights of power would also sow the seeds of their downfall. For in their desperate attempts to preserve and concentrate their power, the Habsburgs turned inward, marrying cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, aunt to nephew, until their blood was as trapped and fragile as the empires they ruled. What began as strategy soon became obsession. The reasoning was simple. If outsiders could not be trusted with the throne, then the family itself must be its own pool of heirs. Each generation drew tighter circles around itself, as if the purity of their lineage was more important than its health. But nature is not kind to such experiments. Over time, the Habsburgs became a living example of how power can rot from within. The infamous Habsburg jaw became the most visible symbol of this curse. Portraits from the 16th and 17th centuries show rulers with long, protruding chins, drooping lips, and faces that seemed unnaturally elongated. At first, it was subtle, a quirk of genetics barely noticed. But by the time of Charles II of Spain, it had become grotesque. His jaw was so misshapen he could barely chew his food. His tongue was so large he struggled to speak clearly. His body was frail, his health perpetually failing. The dynasty that once ruled half the world now sat upon a throne held by a man who could hardly walk without assistance. Charles II's life was a tragedy written in flesh. Born in 1661, he was the product of generations of inbreeding, his family tree folding back onto itself so many times it resembled a not more than a lineage. Doctors noted his body was weak, his intellect limited, his fertility non-existent. He could not produce an heir. In him, the grand design of the Habsburgs collapsed into ruin. When Charles died childless in 1700, the Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty ended, plunging Europe into the War of Spanish Succession, a conflict that consumed nations and reshaped borders, all because one man's body could not bear the burden of his inheritance. But Charles II was not alone. Across the centuries, the Habsburgs struggled with infertility, madness, and illness. Records reveal stillborn children, short-lived heirs, and kings who suffered debilitating diseases. Behind the gilded walls of their palaces, whispers of weakness grew. Servants and courtiers spoke quietly of the family curse. Doctors, constrained by primitive medicine, could do little but watch as one of the most powerful dynasties in history decayed from within. And yet, the curse of inheritance was not just biological. It was psychological and political as well. The obsession with keeping bloodlines pure narrowed their alliances, limited their options, and turned their empire inward. While rivals like the Bourbons of France sought new opportunities and broader networks of power, the Habsburgs strangled themselves in their own web. Their determination to preserve their identity became the very force that ensured its collapse. This tragic irony is not confined to the Habsburgs. Across Europe, dynasties that tried to preserve power through blood alone often suffered similar fates. Madness ran through the line of the British Hanoverians, where King George III's illness inspired whispers of divine punishment. In France, the Bourbons faced repeated crises of succession, each one destabilizing the realm. The very principle that gave dynasties strength, the sanctity of blood, also made them fragile. For what happens when bloodlines fail? When the sacred inheritance produces heirs too weak, too sickly, or too incapable to rule, the entire political structure built upon them begins to crumble. The people of Europe, however, rarely saw the truth. To them, the image of kings remained radiant, adorned in robes and crowns, their portraits touched with flattering brushstrokes. Only those inside the palaces knew the reality, that the empire of blood was rotting from the inside. Ministers worked desperately to cover for weak kings. Armies fought wars in their names, and marriages were arranged with frantic urgency in hopes of producing stronger heirs. But nothing could undo the centuries of choices already made. Perhaps most haunting is the way the Habsburgs seemed aware of their own decline, yet powerless to stop it. Letters from the period reveal their desperation. Rulers praying for heirs, advisors urging marriages that everyone knew would only deepen the genetic traps. The crown, once a symbol of victory, became a burden. Each new birth was not only a cause for celebration, but also a moment of dread. Would this child be strong enough to rule, or would the curse claim them too? And so, the curse of inheritance became the shadow side of dynasty. It was the price of power preserved too zealously, the inevitable outcome of bloodlines treated as sacred and untouchable. The same strategy that had given the Habsburgs half the world eventually left them with nothing more than fragile heirs and empty thrones. Yet, even in their decline, the lesson of the Habsburgs lingered. Other families watched and learned. They saw the dangers of closing bloodlines too tightly, the risks of placing purity above strength. And so, as the Habsburgs faltered, other dynasties began to adapt. Some loosened their rules of marriage, some sought new alliances, and some learned to reinvent themselves altogether. The Habsburgs had shown both the heights a family could reach through blood, and the abyss into which they could fall. The story of the Habsburg curse is more than just a tale of one family's decline. It is a warning, etched into history, of how power can consume itself. It shows us that blood, no matter how sacred, is still flesh, fragile, mortal, and subject to the same laws of nature as any other. Crowns may sanctify it, religion may glorify it, but in the end, bloodlines are as vulnerable as the humans who carry them. And yet, even as the Habsburgs crumbled, bloodlines themselves did not disappear. They transformed. They adapted. Other families saw opportunity in the ruins, stepping forward to seize influence where the Habsburgs had lost it. The age of dynasties was far from over. In fact, it was entering a new phase, one in which crowns would not always be visible, but blood would still guide the fate of nations. For even in the shadows of decline, power has a way of surviving. The Habsburgs may have fallen victim to their own inheritance, but the system they embodied endured. And it is to this endurance, to the way bloodlines reinvented themselves to survive revolutions, wars, and curses, that we now turn. The great courts of Europe once glimmered with the brilliance of kings and queens. Thrones stood as towering symbols of divine authority, their occupants presented as God's chosen rulers. Yet history is cruel to crowns. Revolutions swept across the continent. Armies marched against dynasties, and the 19th and 20th centuries brought the twilight of monarchs. Thrones were overturned, crowns locked away in vaults, and royal families forced to flee their own palaces. It seemed, to the casual observer, that the age of kings had ended. But this was an illusion, for while thrones crumbled, the bloodlines that had once sat upon them did not vanish. They simply slipped into the shadows. The French Revolution marked one of the first great blows. Louis XVI, descendant of the powerful Bourbon dynasty, was dragged to the guillotine in 1793. The crowd cheered as his head fell, believing they had ended centuries of tyranny. Yet even in that moment of supposed finality, the Bourbon line did not disappear. Exiled relatives and surviving cousins lived on, weaving their way quietly through the courts of Europe. Some would even return to claim the throne decades later, proving that blood had a way of resurfacing, even after rivers of it had been spilled. In Russia, the fate of the Romanovs became a symbol of brutality. Nicholas II and his family were executed in 1918, their bodies hidden in shallow graves. The Bolsheviks declared an end to monarchy itself. And yet, the Romanov bloodline did not end there. Cousins had already escaped abroad, and over the decades, claimants continued to emerge, some genuine, some fraudulent. To this day, Romanov descendants live in Europe and America, their names quiet echoes of the dynasty that once ruled a sixth of the Earth's landmass. Even the German Empire, seemingly powerful at the dawn of the 20th century, found its throne shattered by the defeat of World War I. Kaiser Wilhelm II fled to exile in the Netherlands, his empire dismantled. But the Hohenzollern bloodline, ancient rulers of Prussia, survived. Their palaces may have been confiscated, their power stripped, but they continued to exist, their descendants still active in German society. The dynasty that had given Europe both grandeur and war had not died. It had merely shifted into obscurity. The pattern repeated across the continent. The Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed in 1918, the Habsburgs exiled. Yet even stripped of their crowns, they remained wealthy, influential, and well-connected, marrying into other noble houses and quietly keeping their legacy alive. The Italian monarchy under the House of Savoy fell in 1946, its king exiled after siding disastrously with Mussolini. But the family endured, their lineage continuing unbroken, their descendants still walking among us. This transformation, from thrones to shadows, was not accidental. It was adaptation. The world had changed, and bloodlines learned to change with it. Where once their power came from armies and crowns, now it came from alliances, marriages, and wealth preserved through generations. No longer able to rule openly, dynasties began to weave themselves into the very fabric of society. Banking families, industrial magnates, and aristocratic networks provided new channels of influence. Consider Britain, where the monarchy survived but was forced to adapt. The Windsors, once the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, reinvented themselves during World War I, abandoning their German name in favor of something more acceptable to the British public. They survived not by clinging stubbornly to the past, but by reshaping their image, presenting themselves as symbols of continuity rather than absolute rulers. Other families took note. Bloodlines that had lost their crowns learned to survive by obscuring their royal origins or by framing themselves as simply noble rather than monarchic. And yet, even in their diminished state, these families retained a kind of invisible sovereignty. They remained linked through intricate webs of intermarriage. They continued to inherit vast estates, priceless works of art, and wealth accumulated over centuries. They maintained access to corridors of power, not as rulers, but as influencers, whisperers behind the curtain, patrons of politics, society, and culture. The myth that monarchy was dead became a comfortable story for the modern world. People could believe in democracy, in republics, in the power of the people, all while the ancient bloodlines quietly endured. They were no longer in the spotlight, no longer targets of revolution, yet they remained. In palaces turned into museums, in estates still owned by descendants, in family trees carefully recorded and preserved, the dynasties of Europe found ways to remain relevant. In fact, in many cases they thrived. Without the burden of ruling, without the weight of crowns and scepters, dynasties were free to play subtler games. They invested in businesses, aligned themselves with financial empires, and forged connections across borders. Their bloodlines remained valuable currency, a symbol of legitimacy and continuity that could still be exchanged in marriage or leverage in politics. But perhaps the most haunting truth is this. When we look at the map of Europe today, we might think that the monarchies are few and weak, relics of a bygone age. Yet, if we peel back the surface, we find that the hidden kings still exist. Their names may not always be obvious, their crowns may no longer glitter, but their ancestry runs deep in the veins of modern Europe. They are the children of vanished empires, heirs of lost thrones, survivors of revolutions. From the ashes of crumbled kingdoms, they emerged not as rulers of nations, but as architects of influence. Their shadows stretch across boardrooms, diplomatic circles, and high society. And though the guillotine, the firing squad, and the ballot box sought to erase them, the bloodlines endured. This is the paradox of monarchy's decline. The visible power faded, but the invisible power persisted. Thrones may be lost, but shadows cannot be so easily destroyed. And as the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the story of these hidden dynasties took yet another turn. For while some families remained content to linger in obscurity, others found ways to rise again, weaving their bloodlines into the very structures of modern Europe. The Age of Kings was not over. It had merely changed its disguise. And to understand how these bloodlines adapted, survived, and even prospered, we must follow them further, into the subtle realms of wealth, politics, and power, where their influence still flows unseen. The deeper we trace the story of Europe's dynasties, the clearer one truth becomes. No royal family ever stood alone. Behind every crown lies a web, intricate, delicate, and vast, connecting kings and queens across borders, languages, and centuries. The map of Europe may appear divided into distinct kingdoms and empires, but beneath it all lay a single network of blood. For centuries, monarchs used marriage as their most powerful weapon. Armies could be defeated, treaties could be broken, but a marriage forged a bond that outlasted war. A daughter given to a foreign king became both hostage and ambassador, her children heirs to two worlds. Through these unions, dynasties bound themselves together, weaving the continent into a tapestry of kinship. To study this web is to realize that the rulers of Europe were less like rivals and more like members of a single extended family, locked in eternal competition over who would inherit which throne. One of the most famous examples is Queen Victoria, whose descendants came to be known as the grandmother of Europe. By the late 19th century, her children and grandchildren sat upon the thrones of Britain, Germany, Russia, Greece, Norway, Sweden, and Spain. The First World War, a conflict that tore Europe apart, was, in many ways, a family quarrel. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany was Victoria's grandson. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia was her great-grandson. King George V of Britain was another. The letters they exchanged before the war reveal not only political maneuvering, but also the intimate tensions of cousins whose personal loyalties were torn between family and nation. But this pattern began long before Victoria. The Bourbon dynasty of France intermarried with the Spanish Habsburgs, uniting two of the most powerful empires of the 17th century. The Habsburgs themselves were infamous for their relentless dynastic marriages, ensuring that their bloodline extended from Austria to Spain, from the Low Countries to Italy. The result was that by the 18th century, most Catholic thrones in Europe were occupied by relatives, bound together through generations of alliances. Even across religious divides, the web persisted. Protestant and Catholic dynasties alike sought common ground when it served their interests. The marriage of Mary, Queen of Scots, into the French royal family linked Scotland to one of Europe's most powerful courts. The union of James VI of Scotland and Anne of Denmark brought together northern realms. Marriage was the invisible glue that held the continent's politics together. What makes this web remarkable is how it continues to echo today. When we look at the reigning monarchs of modern Europe, from King Charles III in Britain to King Felipe VI in Spain, from Queen Margrethe II of Denmark to King Harald V of Norway, we find that they are all, without exception, related. The threads of kinship stretch across borders, forming a hidden unity beneath the surface of national identity. A crisis in one monarchy often ripples through the others, not only as a matter of diplomacy, but as a family affair. This interconnectedness was not always a blessing. During the Great War, royal cousins found themselves on opposite sides of the battlefield, their shared blood unable to prevent slaughter. In Russia, when the Romanovs begged their British relatives for asylum after the Bolshevik Revolution, political pressures prevented it, sealing their fate. Blood was strong, but not always stronger than politics. Yet the persistence of this web reveals something deeper. These families understood that their survival depended not only on their own throne, but on the strength of the network as a whole. If one dynasty fell, another could shelter its heirs. If one line ended, marriages ensured that another could claim its legacy. The thrones of Europe were less isolated pillars and more like branches of a single tree, pruned, reshaped, and sometimes broken, but all rooted in the same soil. Modern genealogists often marvel at how tightly bound this web became. In fact, studies show that nearly all of Europe's monarchs today can trace their lineage back to a single medieval ruler, Charlemagne. This makes them distant cousins many times over, a reminder that the entire structure of European monarchy is less a collection of separate dynasties and more a single sprawling family tree, split into countless branches but sharing the same trunk. The persistence of this web also explains why bloodlines remained so valuable even after crowns were lost. To be connected by blood to a reigning monarch was to possess a form of currency that could open doors, win marriages, and grant legitimacy. Families who had lost their thrones still wielded this invisible wealth. Their names, their ancestry, and their marriages allowed them to remain part of the conversation of power, even if their armies and kingdoms had long disappeared. And this web was not confined to palaces. It stretched outward into the nobility, into great houses that served as satellites to royal families. Dukes, counts, and princes without thrones became the threads that held the structure together. Many of these houses still exist today, their influence subtle but enduring, their family ties linking them back to monarchs both reigning and fallen. What makes this story so captivating is how much of it remains invisible to the modern eye. We live in a world that prizes individuality, where politicians rise and fall on the strength of votes. Yet beneath the surface lies this ancient network, where the same families that ruled centuries ago still know one another, still intermarry, still recognize the power of blood. The modern viewer may see nations divided by language and politics, but these dynasties see themselves as branches of the same tree, playing a game that has lasted for centuries. And like any web, it is not easily destroyed. Revolutions may cut away one part. Wars may tear through another, but the structure adapts, repairs, and reconfigures itself. The hidden kings of Europe learned long ago that survival comes not from standing alone, but from binding themselves together. That web is their shield, their legacy, and their most enduring weapon. Which raises an unsettling question. If this web of blood has survived centuries of upheaval, what role does it still play today? Is it merely symbolic, a quaint relic of aristocracy? Or does it still influence politics, economics, and culture in ways we fail to see? To answer that, we must turn from genealogy to the question of survival, how these bloodlines managed not just to endure, but to reinvent themselves for the modern age. For in the shadows of wars and revolutions, they found new ways to keep their influence alive. Revolutions were meant to destroy kings. They were the people's answer to centuries of hereditary rule, to palaces built on the sweat of peasants, to bloodlines that claimed the right to rule by birth alone. When the storm of revolution swept across Europe, it promised to sever those bloodlines forever. Heads rolled, crowns were shattered, thrones toppled. Yet, in a strange twist of fate, the revolutions that sought to end dynasties often became the very storms that made them stronger, not in visibility, but in resilience. The French Revolution of 1789 remains the most iconic of these uprisings. The execution of Louis XVI was not merely the death of a king. It was a statement, a declaration that monarchy itself was obsolete. Crowds celebrated as centuries of Bourbon rule ended in one brutal moment. The Queen, Marie Antoinette, followed him to the guillotine, her head displayed to the masses as proof that no one, not even the most glamorous queen in Europe, was untouchable. The revolutionaries proclaimed that the blood of kings was no different from the blood of peasants. And yet, what followed was not the end of monarchy, but its transformation. Within decades, the Bourbons were restored to the throne, carried back not by divine right, but by the shifting winds of politics. Even after being deposed again, their legacy lingered. Today, Bourbon blood still flows in the royal houses of Spain and Luxembourg. The guillotine may have taken the head of a king, but could not erase the dynasty from history. In Russia, revolution came with even greater ferocity. The Romanovs, who had ruled since the early 1600s, were executed in a basement in 1918. Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their children were gunned down, their bodies desecrated, their dynasty declared finished. The Bolsheviks wanted to erase not just the monarchy, but the very memory of it. Yet even here, blood proved harder to kill than crowns. Romanov cousins had already escaped abroad, carrying their name into exile. Throughout the 20th century, claimants to the Russian throne emerged, some true descendants, others opportunists. To this day, Romanov descendants still walk among us, some quietly living private lives, others occasionally stepping into the spotlight. The dynasty may have lost Russia, but did not lose its blood. The same story repeated elsewhere. The German Empire crumbled in 1918, the Hohenzollerns stripped of their throne. Austria-Hungary collapsed, the Habsburgs driven into exile. Italy abolished its monarchy in 1946, sending the House of Savoy into obscurity. Each revolution and republic seemed to hammer another nail into monarchy's coffin. And yet, each time, the families endured. They reinvented themselves as private citizens, aristocrats, businessmen, even politicians. Without the burden of ruling, they adapted to survive in new forms. Why did revolutions fail to kill dynasties completely? The answer lies in the very nature of blood. A king can be dethroned, a crown can be confiscated, but a bloodline cannot be erased without extermination. And extermination, the deliberate wiping out of an entire family, is far more difficult, dangerous, and morally horrifying than executing a single ruler. In most cases, relatives escaped, hidden by allies or sheltered by other monarchs. Bloodlines became like seeds scattered by the wind, ready to take root elsewhere. Another reason is perception. Even in the heat of revolution, dynasties held a strange allure. Their names carried weight, their ancestry whispered of legitimacy. New governments, eager to stabilize themselves, sometimes found it useful to negotiate with exiled royals, or even restore them temporarily. Bloodlines that had seemed finished returned, time and again, like ghosts that refused to be buried. But perhaps the most important reason is that dynasties learned to adapt. Stripped of crowns, they sought new forms of power. Some turned to finance, aligning themselves with the rising world of banking and industry. Others focused on maintaining their estates and lands, ensuring that wealth, if not sovereignty, would carry their families forward. Many shifted their identities from rulers to symbols, allowing them to survive in a world increasingly hostile to monarchs. In this way, revolutions acted less like executions and more like crucibles. They burned away the visible trappings of monarchy, the crowns, the palaces, the armies, but what emerged was often a leaner, quieter, and more resilient form of dynastic power. The bloodlines entered the shadows, and from there, they proved even harder to destroy. Consider how these revolutions shaped the modern monarchies that still exist today. The British monarchy, which survived while so many others fell, did so because it adapted in the face of revolutionary fervor. The Windsors learned to reinvent themselves as servants of the people, not masters. They reshaped their image as national symbols rather than absolute rulers. Without the lessons of revolution, it is doubtful they would still stand. And so we see the paradox. Revolutions meant to end monarchy often ensured its survival. They forced dynasties to evolve, to shed their skins, to hide their power more carefully. The visible thrones may have disappeared, but the invisible network of blood endured. Today, when we look at Europe's surviving monarchies, or even at its exiled royal houses, we see the legacy of this adaptation. The French Revolution did not kill the Bourbons. The Russian Revolution did not erase the Romanovs. The fall of empires in the 20th century did not scatter the Habsburgs or the Hohenzollerns beyond recognition. Instead, all these families adjusted, weaving themselves into the modern world, often unnoticed by those who believed monarchy was long dead. This raises a haunting question. Were revolutions truly victories of the people, or were they merely another chapter in the long survival story of bloodlines? For every guillotine blade and firing squad, there was a hidden marriage, a surviving child, a cousin sheltered abroad. Power shifted forms, but it never truly vanished. The blood of kings, it seems, is not so easily spilled. It seeps into the soil of history, invisible yet enduring, ready to rise again when the moment is right. And to understand how these bloodlines managed to not only endure revolutions, but to thrive after them, we must look closer at the way they tied themselves to wealth, to alliances, and to new forms of influence. Because if revolutions failed to erase them, perhaps money, and the empires built from it, became their new crowns. If revolutions stripped Europe's dynasties of their crowns, they did not strip them of their wealth. In fact, for many noble families, the loss of thrones was less an end than a transformation. Their palaces may have been nationalized, their titles mocked, their armies disbanded. Yet behind the scenes, their fortunes endured. And from those fortunes, the hidden kings of Europe built new empires, not of territories, but of influence. We often imagine monarchs as rulers bound to crowns and scepters, but the truth is that dynasties were also some of the greatest landowners, bankers, and investors the world has ever seen. Over centuries, they accumulated vast estates, mineral rights, and trade networks. Even when revolutions forced them into exile, much of this wealth remained beyond the reach of new governments. Properties were hidden in trusts, wealth was moved abroad, and allies in other countries ensured the survival of dynastic fortunes. The Habsburgs provide a striking example. When Austria declared itself a republic in 1919, the monarchy was abolished and the Habsburgs exiled. But they were far from destitute. For centuries, they had married into other houses and spread their influence across Europe. Though they lost Vienna's Hofburg Palace and Schönbrunn, their descendants retained control of castles, estates, and businesses spread throughout the continent. Even today, members of the Habsburg family remain among Europe's wealthiest aristocrats, quietly managing vineyards, properties, and investments. The Romanovs, despite their brutal fall, left traces of wealth scattered across Europe. Before the Revolution, the family had invested heavily abroad, and jewels, artworks, and fortunes were smuggled out during the chaos of 1917. Romanov descendants in Paris, London, and New York built comfortable lives on these hidden reserves. Some estates were lost, yes, but the bloodline's wealth endured, slipping through the cracks of history like water. The Windsors, meanwhile, were masters of adaptation. They retained their crown, but they also learned the value of managing wealth like any great dynasty. Vast estates, such as Sandringham and Balmoral, remain private property of the royal family. The Duchy of Lancaster and Duchy of Cornwall generate millions each year, funding the monarchy outside of taxpayer support. Add to this art collections, jewelry, and centuries of landholdings, and the Windsors represent not only a monarchy, but a business empire hidden in plain sight. Even dethroned dynasties found ways to reinvent themselves financially. The Bourbon Parmas of Italy and Luxembourg became industrialists and investors. The Savoys of Italy scattered across Europe after 1946, some entering politics, others managing private businesses. The Greek royal family, forced into exile after the fall of the monarchy in the 1970s, retained fortunes through shrewd marriages and financial ties to London. Bloodlines that once ruled kingdoms turned to new thrones, banks, corporations, and foundations. What makes this wealth especially intriguing is how it operates across borders. These families, bound by centuries of intermarriage, often pooled resources through trusts and alliances. A Habsburg heir might manage properties in Austria, Italy, and Spain simultaneously. A Bourbon descendant might inherit estates in France and Spain, along with claims in Luxembourg. Wealth moved fluidly, much like the bloodlines themselves, making it nearly impossible for any one government to confiscate it entirely. And wealth, unlike crowns, offered new forms of influence. Money funded marriages that maintained dynastic connections. It opened doors in politics and diplomacy, allowing former monarchs to act as intermediaries between nations. It gave them soft power, the ability to influence without ruling. In a world increasingly driven by capital, dynasties discovered that they could remain relevant not by commanding armies, but by owning land, industries, and institutions. The persistence of this financial power also explains why aristocracy remains so deeply rooted in European society. While democracy and capitalism promise to create equality, dynastic wealth often ensure the opposite. Estates passed down for centuries still dominate the countryside. Royal families continue to sit atop immense private fortunes, even when their political crowns have long since vanished. They may no longer demand taxes, but they still collect rents, profits, and dividends. There is also the symbolic dimension. Wealth preserved the aura of monarchy even after thrones were lost. A dethroned king might no longer wear a crown, but he could still host balls in glittering palaces, still commission portraits, still live in a manner befitting royalty. This performance of grandeur kept dynasties alive in the imagination of the people. They remained figures of fascination, symbols of continuity in a world of upheaval. The lesson of the wealth of blood is clear. Dynasties are not only political structures, but economic machines. They understood that power built solely on titles could be overthrown. Power built on land, gold, and estates was far harder to destroy. Revolutions could storm palaces, but they could not confiscate trust funds hidden in foreign banks. Governments could seize castles, but jewels and artworks slipped across borders, carried by loyal servants or sympathetic allies. This resilience continues into the present day. Many of Europe's surviving royal families remain among the wealthiest citizens of their nations. Even those who lost thrones centuries ago continue to own vast estates, their names carried on through trusts and corporations. Bloodlines have learned to thrive not by ruling nations, but by ruling markets. Their crowns are no longer golden. They are portfolios, real estate deeds, and bank accounts. And yet, there is something deeper at play here. Wealth was not only a means of survival. It was also a way of keeping dynasties interconnected. Money funded marriages, estates became dowries, and financial stability made unions between noble families possible even after political power was lost. Wealth became the bloodstream of the dynastic web, ensuring that the hidden kings of Europe remained tied together through both blood and gold. If revolutions taught them to adapt, wealth gave them the tools to endure. The dynasties that survived were those that understood the shifting nature of power, from crowns to shadows, from thrones to estates, from scepters to banknotes. But wealth alone was not enough. To truly remain relevant, dynasties needed something else: visibility. They needed to remind the people of their presence, to keep themselves in the public imagination. And so, as the 19th and 20th centuries unfolded, bloodlines turned to spectacle, to ceremonies, rituals, and carefully crafted images as their new weapons of influence. If dynasties could no longer command armies or dictate laws, they learned to command something equally potent: imagination. Where their crowns once symbolized unquestionable authority, their survival now depended on pageantry, spectacle, and ritual. Monarchs and exiled royals alike mastered the art of performance, using tradition and ceremony as a theater in which they could continue to project influence. Power, after all, is not only about control, it is also about perception. To the ordinary person, a king's legitimacy often lay less in his decrees and more in the image he embodied. A monarch dressed in resplendent robes, riding in a gilded carriage, or presiding over a cathedral filled with incense conveyed a sense of grandeur that no ballot box could replicate. Even when thrones fell, dynasties understood that if they could keep the spectacle alive, they could remain relevant in the hearts and minds of the people. The British monarchy became the supreme masters of this art. By the late 19th century, their political powers had diminished dramatically, yet the grandeur of coronations, royal weddings, and jubilees only grew. Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897 was not just a celebration of her reign, but a carefully orchestrated display of imperial might. Troops from across the empire marched in London, ships sailed in formation, and the Queen herself appeared as a living symbol of unity. It was theater on a global scale, convincing millions that the monarchy remained the heart of the empire. The coronation of Elizabeth II in 1953 revealed the enduring power of such spectacle. Broadcast live on television, it was one of the first truly global media events. Viewers from Canada to India witnessed the ancient ritual of crowning, the glittering jewels, the solemn oaths. In an age of modernity, the old ceremony gave the monarchy an aura of timelessness. Elizabeth was not just a queen. She was the embodiment of continuity, binding past, present, and future. But Britain was not alone. Across Europe, even dethroned monarchs relied on spectacle to maintain their mystique. The Romanovs in exile continued to host elaborate balls in Paris, attended by aristocrats, exiles, and admirers who longed for the lost grandeur of Imperial Russia. These gatherings were not merely social events. They were acts of remembrance, performances of a monarchy that no longer ruled but still existed in the imagination. Similarly, the Habsburgs, even after losing their throne in Austria, maintained a regal presence through weddings, funerals, and appearances at Catholic ceremonies. Their elaborate family rituals, often covered in newspapers, reinforced the idea that they remained an eternal dynasty, even if the Republic had stripped them of crowns. The rituals were reminders that thrones could be abolished, but traditions could not so easily be erased. Theater of power extended beyond ceremonies into symbols. Dynasties guarded their coats of arms, flags, and insignias with fervor, knowing that these visual markers carried immense weight. A crest engraved on a building, a crown embroidered on a banner, or even the use of royal titles in exile reminded people of the legitimacy of a bloodline. These symbols acted like signatures of history, branding families with an authority that outlasted revolutions. Clothing, too, played a central role in this theater. The robes, crowns, and jewels worn by monarchs during ceremonies were not mere ornaments. They were scripts in a performance of continuity. The British crown jewels, guarded in the Tower of London, symbolized not only wealth, but also the unbroken line of monarchy. Each stone carries stories of conquest, diplomacy, and inheritance. To display them is to remind the world that the monarchy endures, even if the meaning of power has changed. This theatricality also adapted to the modern world. As media expanded, dynasties mastered its use. Royal weddings became spectacles broadcast to millions, from the marriage of Charles and Diana in 1981 to that of William and Catherine in 2011. These were not simply family unions. They were global performances of tradition and romance, drawing vast audiences and cementing the monarchy as part of collective culture. Through television and later the internet, the theater of power reached further than ever before. But this spectacle was not always harmless. For many dynasties, maintaining grandeur also meant facing criticism. The expense of ceremonies, the display of jewels, and the preservation of rituals often sparked debates about relevance in democratic societies. Yet paradoxically, these criticisms only reinforced the sense that monarchies were something apart, something extraordinary. Whether admired or questioned, they remained at the center of public attention. Even in republics, dethroned families harnessed theater to keep alive claims to legitimacy. Pretenders to thrones staged investiture ceremonies, wore crowns in exile, and maintained mock courts that preserved the traditions of their lost kingdoms. To their supporters, these performances carried real political meaning. To others, they were curiosities. But in both cases, the theater ensured that the dynasties were never entirely forgotten. The endurance of dynastic power through theater reveals something fundamental about human societies: the need for ritual. Republics and democracies have their own ceremonies, inaugurations, parades, national holidays, yet the rituals of monarchy often carry a deeper resonance, rooted in centuries of repetition. By embodying these rituals, dynasties provide a link to the past that feels almost sacred. This is why the theater of power remains such a formidable tool. Monarchs and their descendants may no longer wield armies, but they wield narratives. They remind the public of continuity in an unstable world, of tradition in times of change. Through spectacle, they craft identities not just for themselves, but for nations. The theater is both survival and strategy, ensuring that crowns may lose their thrones but never their place in history. And yet, behind the velvet curtains of ceremony lies another secret to dynastic survival, one less visible than jewels or coronations, but just as powerful. If pageantry kept them in the public eye, then alliances ensured they remained indispensable. For dynasties learned that their most enduring strength was not only in spectacle or wealth, but in their ability to weave bloodlines into a web that spanned the entire continent. In the grand chessboard of European history, few strategies proved as effective as marriage. Where armies could be defeated and empires dismantled, a wedding vow could forge alliances, prevent wars, or secure claims that endured for generations. It was through this strategy that dynasties extended their reach, ensuring their survival not by the sword, but by the blood that flowed through their veins. The dynastic marriage was more than a union of two people. It was the weaving of a vast web that bound together kings, queens, dukes, and emperors across an entire continent. The most striking example of this strategy is embodied in the Habsburgs. Few families mastered the art of marital diplomacy as completely as they did. From the late medieval period through the modern era, the Habsburgs expanded their dominion not primarily through conquest, but through carefully arranged marriages. The family motto, often summarized as "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry," captures their genius. By uniting with powerful houses across Spain, Hungary, Bohemia, and beyond, they built an empire that spanned Europe and reached across oceans. The consequences of these alliances were enormous. The marriage of Maximilian I to Mary of Burgundy in 1477 brought the wealthy Burgundian Netherlands under Habsburg control. His grandson, Charles V, inherited not only Spain and its vast overseas empire, but also territories across Italy, Germany, and the Low Countries. No single conquest could have delivered such a domain. It was the web of blood, intricate, intentional, and enduring, that created the mightiest empire Europe had seen since Rome. Yet this strategy was not unique to the Habsburgs. The Bourbons, the Romanovs, the Hanoverians, and the Wittelsbachs all engaged in similar practices. Dynasties sought to link themselves to as many ruling houses as possible, creating a safety net that ensured their survival, even if their immediate thrones were lost. Through marriage, they became indispensable to one another, forming a network that blurred the lines between nations. By the 19th century, the scale of this interconnectedness was staggering. Nearly every royal house in Europe was related by blood. Queen Victoria of Britain, nicknamed the Grandmother of Europe, exemplified this phenomenon. Her children and grandchildren married into royal families across the continent, from Germany to Russia to Spain. The result was that by the early 20th century, the crowned heads of Europe were cousins, sometimes literal first cousins, bound together in a web so tight it seemed unbreakable. But blood could be both a blessing and a curse. The shared lineage often made dynasties stronger, but also carried dangers. When Europe erupted into World War I, monarchs who were family members suddenly found themselves on opposing sides. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, King George V of Britain, and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia were all related, yet their kinship could not prevent the devastation of war. The web of blood, once a shield, became a tangle that no one could escape. Marriage alliances also came with another risk: the hazards of too much intermarriage. The Habsburgs, for example, became notorious for their practice of marrying within their own family to preserve dynastic claims. Over generations, this led to severe genetic consequences, culminating in King Charles II of Spain, whose physical and mental infirmities rendered him incapable of ruling effectively. His death without heirs in 1700 triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, proving that even the most carefully woven web could unravel under the weight of its own design. Yet despite these dangers, dynastic intermarriage remained a powerful survival strategy. Even dethroned families relied on it. Pretenders to lost thrones often married into reigning dynasties, keeping their claims alive in blood, if not in law. In some cases, these unions allowed exiled families to stage comebacks, reclaiming power generations after they had been cast out. The web also extended beyond Europe's borders. European dynasties married into families from Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, creating bonds that reached far beyond the continent. These alliances often had diplomatic motives, cementing treaties, securing trade routes, or projecting influence into distant regions. Though not as numerous as the European intermarriages, they illustrate the global dimension of dynastic strategy. This web of blood also created a paradox. Monarchies were both national and transnational. A king was expected to embody the soul of his nation, yet his blood tied him to foreign lands. This duality often created suspicion among subjects, who feared that their rulers were more loyal to family than to country. At times it was true. Dynasties often placed the survival of their bloodline above the interests of their nations. In this sense, the hidden kings of Europe were not merely rulers of states, but custodians of a transcontinental family that operated beyond the control of parliaments or peoples. Even today, traces of this web remain visible. Modern European monarchs are still connected through family ties that go back centuries. The marriage of Prince Philip to Queen Elizabeth II linked the British royal family with the Greek and Danish royal houses. King Felipe VI of Spain is connected by blood to both the Bourbons and a Habsburg legacy. These bonds, while no longer carrying the same political weight, remain powerful symbols of continuity. The web of blood shows us something profound about dynastic survival, that power can outlast thrones when it flows through veins. Nations may rise and fall, republics may replace kingdoms, but bloodlines can remain unbroken, linking past to present in ways invisible to the casual observer. It is this web, hidden, resilient, and sometimes dangerous, that allowed dynasties to endure when empires collapsed around them. Yet alliances alone were not enough. Dynasties needed more than blood to survive. They required places where their presence could not be challenged, where even in exile they could remain untouchable. To understand how families clung to power after losing their crowns, we must journey into the sanctuaries that became their secret strongholds, the safe havens where monarchs without thrones still ruled in shadows. When a crown was lost, the dynasty did not vanish. Instead, it retreated into strongholds, castles, palaces, and hidden estates that became the sanctuaries of exiled royalty. These places were more than homes. They were symbols of continuity, fortresses of memory, and safe harbors where plans for restoration could quietly take shape. Behind the walls of these strongholds, dethroned monarchs preserved not only their safety, but also their authority, their rituals, and their identity as rulers, even when nations had declared them obsolete. One of the most striking examples lies in Austria. After the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1918, the Habsburgs were formally banished, stripped of their power and their right to reside in Austria. Yet their palaces and castles remained testaments to their centuries of dominance. Schönbrunn Palace, the sprawling summer residence in Vienna, became a kind of frozen stage where the grandeur of the dynasty lingered long after their departure. Even in exile, the Habsburgs used these properties through legal battles, symbolic claims, or family reunions as anchors to a vanished empire. The walls of Schönbrunn and Hofburg were reminders to Europe that the dynasty had been dethroned, but not erased. In France, the Bourbons and later the Orleans branch of the royal family found similar refuge in estates that became their political and cultural bases. During the 19th century, the Château d'Eu and other noble homes provided not only comfort, but also a stage for royalist supporters. These estates often became meeting grounds for monarchists plotting a return to power. The chateau was not merely a residence. It was a rallying point, a sanctuary where history was not over, but waiting for its next chapter. For the Romanovs, exile turned their strongholds into myth. After the Russian Revolution, many members of the family fled to Europe, carrying with them jewels, icons, and fragments of their imperial heritage. In Paris, estates and grand homes became miniature courts where exiled princes and grand duchesses hosted lavish gatherings. These sanctuaries served two purposes. They preserved the culture of imperial Russia, and they projected an image of legitimacy, as if the dynasty still ruled in spirit, if not in law. For monarchist sympathizers in exile, attending these events was akin to stepping back into the lost empire. But not all strongholds were palaces of glittering splendor. Some were secluded estates, remote and fortified, chosen for their strategic safety rather than their grandeur. In the aftermath of upheaval, dynasties needed secure locations where they could be shielded from assassins, revolutionary mobs, or hostile governments. Castles perched on mountains, manors hidden in forests, and villas along guarded coastlines became lifelines for royal families who lived with the constant fear of betrayal or capture. These sanctuaries often held more than symbolic value. They served as hubs of political influence. Diplomats, Loyalists and monarchist conspirators would travel to these hidden courts to negotiate alliances, plot strategies, or simply reaffirm their loyalty. A dethroned king might have no army, but within his sanctuary he could still wield influence, issuing manifestos, declaring claims, and presenting himself as the rightful ruler in waiting. Strongholds also allowed dynasties to preserve traditions that might otherwise have been lost. Royal baptisms, weddings, and funerals continued within these estates, performed with the same rituals as if they were still on their thrones. In this way, the sanctuaries became living archives of dynastic identity. Generations grew up in exile, raised in castles that were half family home, half political symbol, where children were taught to believe that their blood carried an unbroken right to rule. The survival of these sanctuaries was not always guaranteed. Some were seized, others destroyed, and many were subject to constant surveillance by governments that feared their symbolic power. Yet even when stripped of their physical homes, dynasties adapted. Their strongholds became less about walls and more about networks of influence. A Parisian apartment filled with portraits and heirlooms could function as effectively as a palace in Vienna, provided it kept the dynastic story alive. There is something haunting about these secret strongholds. They were places of survival, but also of ghosts. A dethroned king walking through the empty halls of a palace once filled with courtiers. A queen preserving jewels in secret while revolutionaries ruled her country. Children growing up with titles of princes and princesses, yet playing in gardens that were only shadows of lost empires. These strongholds carried both pride and sorrow, splendor and exile. And yet, they fulfilled their purpose. They kept the dynasties alive. They preserved memory, nurtured legitimacy, and ensured that even when nations tried to bury monarchies, the crowns continued to exist in hiding. From these sanctuaries, dynasties would sometimes rise again, restore to thrones they had once lost. But not all strongholds relied on stone walls or secluded estates. There was another, even greater sanctuary available to Europe's hidden kings, one that transcended national borders and political shifts. That sanctuary was the church, whose altars, rituals, and papal blessing could shelter dynasties, sanctify their claims, and grant them legitimacy even in exile. For centuries, crowns and crosses were inseparable. Monarchs could command armies and levy taxes, but without the blessing of the church, their power seemed fragile, even illegitimate. It was the church that anointed kings, sanctified their rule, and framed their authority as divine rather than human. In this way, the church became not only a partner, but also a shield for dynasties. Even when thrones crumbled, the sanctuary of faith offered protection, legitimacy, and sometimes the promise of restoration. The medieval coronation ritual is perhaps the clearest example of this dependence. A king was not truly a king until he had been anointed with holy oil, blessed by bishops, and crowned in a cathedral. This ceremony, rooted in biblical tradition, transformed a ruler from a mere man into God's chosen representative on earth. The French kings, for instance, were anointed with oil said to have been delivered from heaven by a dove, giving them a sacred aura that no rebellion could easily dispel. To overthrow a monarch was not just to topple a ruler. It was to defy the divine order itself. The Vatican's role in this theater of legitimacy was immense. Popes often served as arbiters in disputes between dynasties, deciding who had the greater right to rule. A papal blessing could secure a throne, while excommunication could strip a monarch of his authority in the eyes of his people. Dynasties learned quickly that their survival often depended on maintaining strong ties with the church, even when political alliances shifted. Consider the Habsburgs. Their centuries-long relationship with Catholicism was not only a matter of faith, but also a deliberate strategy of survival. By aligning themselves with the Vatican, they cast their dynasty as defenders of the faith, protectors of Christendom against Protestant reformers and Ottoman invaders alike. This identity gave them a moral authority that often outweighed political weakness. Even after losing their empire, the Habsburgs remained entwined with the Catholic hierarchy, ensuring that their name carried weight in the church long after their crowns had been taken. The Bourbons, too, leveraged the church to reinforce their dynasty. In France, the alliance between throne and altar was so deep that the king was often described as the eldest son of the church. Royal processions included not just nobles, but bishops, abbots, and cardinals, weaving the monarchy into the very fabric of Catholic identity. When the Bourbons were overthrown during the French Revolution, Royalists argued not only for their political restoration, but for the return of God's rightful order. The Church, in turn, often framed the monarchy's survival as a matter of divine justice. Even in exile, dynasties relied on the Church to sanctify their claims. Pretenders to lost thrones often received papal recognition or at least tacit support, giving their cause a moral weight that political treaties alone could not. Exiled kings and queens frequently lived near monasteries or papal estates, cloaking their diminished status in the dignity of faith. A royal wedding blessed by a pope or bishop, even in exile, carried a legitimacy that could not be erased by revolution. But this alliance was not always straightforward. At times, the Church wielded its spiritual authority as a weapon, turning against monarchs who defied it. The investiture controversy of the Middle Ages, in which popes and kings clashed over the right to appoint bishops, revealed the fragile balance between crowns and crosses. Monarchs who defied the Church often found themselves isolated, their dynasties weakened. Even so, the very act of conflict proved the depth of the Church's influence. No dynasty could afford to ignore it. In Orthodox lands, the relationship was different but equally potent. The Russian Tsars claimed not just papal blessing, but divine appointment through the Orthodox Church. The coronation of a Tsar in Moscow's Assumption Cathedral was a sacred ritual that presented the monarch as God's chosen ruler, uniting faith and empire in a single figure. Even after the Romanovs were executed in 1918, the Orthodox Church preserved their memory as martyrs, sanctifying their bloodline and transforming their dynasty into symbols of faith under persecution. Religion offered dynasties something that politics alone could not: a sense of eternal destiny. Empires could fall, republics could rise, but the Church's language of divine will made monarchy seem timeless. Even dethroned kings could argue that their crowns were not lost, merely hidden, waiting for God's chosen moment to return. This belief provided hope for exiled dynasties and loyalty among their followers, who often framed political struggles as spiritual battles between order and chaos, faith and rebellion. The influence of the Church extended into the cultural imagination as well. Monarchs were often depicted in paintings, songs, and sermons as God's chosen protectors, their crowns glowing with divine light. Even in times of doubt, these images reminded subjects that kingship was not merely political, but sacred. In this sense, the Church provided dynasties with more than legitimacy. It gave them myth, the powerful sense that their bloodlines carried a destiny written in heaven. The bond between thrones and altars is why many dynasties, even today, still emphasize their religious ties. Royal weddings, baptisms, and funerals are steeped in ancient liturgy, echoing the same rituals that once crowned emperors. These ceremonies may no longer dictate political power, but they keep alive the aura of sacred legitimacy that dynasties have carried for centuries. Yet faith, for all its strength, could not always shield dynasties from collapse. The Church could bless crowns and sanctify rituals, but it could not always prevent revolution or war. Dynasties needed more than divine sanction. They needed wealth. And often, it was the hidden fortunes of monarchs that ensured their survival in exile, giving them the means to endure when thrones and crowns were stripped away. When crowns fell and palaces were seized, dynasties discovered that survival depended not on titles, but on treasure. Wealth became their most vital weapon, a lifeline that allowed dethroned monarchs to maintain influence, preserve traditions, and plan for possible restoration. In exile, fortunes were carefully hidden, moved across borders, and transformed into tools of power that could outlast revolutions, wars, and political upheavals. The Romanovs offer one of the most striking examples. As the Bolsheviks stormed palaces and executed Tsar Nicholas II and his immediate family, other members of the dynasty fled abroad, carrying what wealth they could salvage. Jewelry, art, and estates were smuggled to Paris, London, and other European capitals. These hidden treasures allowed the family to live comfortably in exile, host gatherings that maintained their prestige, and retain a sense of authority even without a throne. Their wealth became a shield against the erasure that revolutions sought to impose. Similarly, the Habsburgs used their financial acumen to survive post-World War I Europe. Though stripped of the Austro-Hungarian crown, they still possessed properties and estates scattered across multiple countries. Trusts, offshore holdings, and foreign investments enabled them to maintain an aristocratic lifestyle and fund political and charitable activities. In some cases, these funds allowed them to negotiate with governments for the return of certain properties or titles. Wealth in exile was a form of power that required neither armies nor votes. The Bourbons also demonstrated remarkable resilience. After being exiled from France and Spain during periods of revolution and republicanism, they leveraged their remaining assets, estates, dowries, and foreign alliances to sustain their influence. Some members entered politics or business, strategically investing their fortunes to ensure their family name remained significant. Even when crowns were lost, money ensured that their legacy persisted, granting them a foothold in European high society and political circles. Exile demanded both secrecy and strategy. Wealth could not be flaunted openly, as hostile governments might seize it. Monarchs used complex networks of banks, trusts, and loyal agents to protect their assets. Jewelry was often disguised or hidden in plain sight. Estates were rented under false names, and investments were made through intermediaries. These efforts created a shadow economy of royal influence, one that preserved dynasties while keeping them largely invisible to the public eye. Money also allowed exiled dynasties to cultivate relationships. By funding charities, cultural institutions, or political causes, they maintained relevance even without a throne. A Romanov princess might sponsor a museum exhibition. A Habsburg archduke could support Catholic institutions. These acts were more than philanthropy. They were reminders to the world that the dynasty still existed and wielded influence, quietly shaping culture and society from behind the scenes. The adaptation extended to strategic marriages. Exiled families often used wealth to arrange unions with other noble or wealthy houses, reinforcing the web of bloodlines and ensuring that their descendants would remain connected to power. Money became a bridge between dynasties, maintaining alliances that could span generations even when political control had vanished. In this sense, wealth functioned not only as survival, but as insurance, keeping dynasties integrated into Europe's network of influence. Even the modern Windsors understood the power of finance. While their crown remained intact, their approach to wealth has long been strategic. The Duchy of Cornwall and the Duchy of Lancaster generate substantial annual income, supporting not only the monarchy's functions, but also their global influence. Investments, landholdings, and private estates allow them to operate independently of government subsidies, giving them flexibility to act as both symbolic leaders and financial actors in a complex international world. Beyond Europe, the principle remains the same. Royal families in the Middle East and Asia, when dethroned, have similarly relied on hidden wealth to survive politically turbulent times. The strategy of preserving assets, investing wisely, and maintaining secrecy is universal. A dethroned monarch without money is a monarch erased, while a financially secure exile can remain a player in international networks for decades. Wealth in exile also reinforces memory. Palaces may fall into the hands of governments, but jewels, art, and estates kept abroad preserve the identity of a dynasty. Even generations later, heirs can reclaim symbols of their past, using these assets to reinforce legitimacy and project influence. A dynasty that loses its throne but retains its wealth retains the possibility of returning, or at least asserting moral and cultural authority. Yet wealth is not merely material. It is a weapon of strategy. By controlling resources, dynasties can influence political decisions, fund loyalists, and shape narratives about history itself. A well-placed donation, a secret endowment, or an investment in media can allow a family without a throne to remain remarkably powerful. Money, in exile, becomes the invisible crown that ensures survival and influence even when the world assumes the dynasty is gone. Ultimately, the lesson is clear. Crowns fall, but fortune endures. Through careful management of wealth, dynasties have preserved themselves across centuries of upheaval. They have survived revolution, war, exile, and societal change, using money not just to live, but to wield influence and maintain their identity. In the hidden corridors of history, wealth in exile proves as potent as armies, as enduring as bloodlines, and as subtle as the quiet diplomacy that keeps dynasties alive when thrones no longer exist. This foundation of secret wealth sets the stage for the next element of dynastic endurance: influence in politics and culture. For even with money, survival required dynasties to remain relevant, shaping the world from behind the scenes without overt power. Even without thrones, crowns, or armies, dynasties found ways to remain potent forces in European politics. Their power became subtler, operating in shadows rather than in public, wielded through wealth, family networks, and cultural influence. Exiled monarchs, dethroned princes, and hidden heirs learned that true survival depended not on overt rule, but on the ability to shape events without drawing attention, to be invisible yet indispensable. The web of bloodlines remained the core of this influence. Dynasties married strategically, connecting themselves across countries and continents. But beyond marriage, they cultivated relationships with politicians, financiers, military leaders, and intellectuals, building a network of loyalty that could be activated when opportunity arose. Even without official authority, a single endorsement or discreet intervention could shift policies, sway elections, or influence treaties. Power, in this context, was not measured by law or title, but by the capacity to make things happen unseen. Consider the Bourbon-Orleans family in France. After being deposed multiple times, they remained a focal point for royalist supporters. While they could not govern, they influenced politics by supporting sympathetic parties, funding campaigns, and cultivating public opinion. Their private meetings and patronage helped keep the idea of monarchy alive in the national consciousness. Monarchists and exiles alike recognized that these dynasties still wielded moral authority, capable of guiding political movement from the shadows. The Habsburgs, exiled from Austria, similarly shaped European diplomacy without a throne. They maintained connections with Catholic institutions, foreign monarchs, and former courtiers, acting as intermediaries in disputes and offering counsel in matters of European politics. Their influence was subtle: letters, private meetings, and strategic alliances, yet it allowed the dynasty to remain a force capable of shaping outcomes despite being legally powerless. Even during the turbulent interwar period, Habsburg descendants were consulted by diplomats seeking stability, demonstrating that the weight of history and blood could still bend politics to their will. Cultural influence became another tool of power. Dynasties sponsored artists, writers, and intellectuals, ensuring that their values and legacy were reflected in public discourse. Exiled Romanovs in Paris supported Russian émigré culture, keeping Russian traditions alive and reminding the world of their dynasty's heritage. In this way, dynasties operated like cultural currents, subtle yet persistent, shaping identity and ideology in ways that governments alone could not. Wealth amplified this shadow influence. With money in reserve, dynasties could fund political causes, establish foundations, or support movements aligned with their interests. They could sponsor newspapers, cultural institutions, and scholarly work that reinforced their vision of history and legitimacy. In doing so, they maintained relevance and subtly guided the narrative about their own role in history. Power was no longer a matter of law. It was the ability to shape perception. Even surviving monarchies utilized these shadow strategies. The British monarchy, for example, gradually ceded political authority while cultivating a symbolic presence that allowed soft influence over public sentiment and international relations. Through ceremonial diplomacy, charitable patronage, and strategic media engagement, they demonstrated that visibility without formal power could sustain relevance and control in nuanced ways. The line between political influence and cultural authority blurred, but the result was unmistakable. Monarchy remained a potent force. The intertwining of blood, wealth, and culture created a system that was remarkably resilient. Revolutions, wars, and political upheavals might destroy governments, topple thrones, or scatter royal families. Yet these dynasties endured through networks that were invisible, flexible, and nearly impossible to dismantle completely. Even as Europe became more democratic, the hidden influence of aristocracy persisted, operating in ways that the public rarely noticed but that shaped the course of nations. Yet shadow influence was not only about politics or culture, it was also about survival. By remaining unseen, dynasties protected themselves from enemies who might otherwise target them. Secret alliances, discreet financial maneuvering, and careful placement of family members allowed them to survive revolutions and wars that had claimed the lives of their ancestors. In this way, shadow influence was both defensive and proactive, a means of navigating a world that had become hostile to overt monarchy. There were risks, of course. Exiled monarchs and claimants who overreached could provoke governments or rival families, leading to conflict, exile, or even assassination. But the very caution required in these maneuvers reinforced the sophistication of dynastic networks. They became masters of discretion, using influence like a chess game, with decades-long strategies and moves invisible to the untrained eye. In essence, the hidden kings of Europe learned a critical lesson. True power is not always displayed on thrones or announced in parliaments. Sometimes, the most enduring influence is the influence that remains unseen, unacknowledged, yet undeniable in its effect. Monarchs without crowns, princes without armies, and exiled queens all leveraged this principle to ensure that dynasties not only survived, but continued to shape Europe's destiny in ways that the casual observer might never detect. This invisible power set the stage for a surprising twist. Even in modern democratic Europe, where kings and queens no longer wield absolute authority, the hidden bloodlines of these dynasties continue to exert influence. They do so through diplomacy, business, philanthropy, and culture, proving that the resilience of dynasties is not a relic of history, but a living, evolving force. The shadow of influence, subtle and pervasive, connects directly to the next element of dynastic endurance, secrecy. For in addition to operating behind the scenes, the hidden kings relied on a veil of mystery, protecting their strategies, fortunes, and alliances from public scrutiny. Only by controlling what was known could they control their legacy. Every dynasty carries its public face, glittering coronations, elegant weddings, and charitable patronage. But behind the facade lies a shadow world of secrets, intrigues, and scandals. These hidden aspects of royal life were not merely personal. They were strategic tools, ways to protect power, manipulate alliances, and preserve influence across generations. In the hands of savvy dynasties, secrecy was as crucial as wealth or blood, and scandals, whether real or fabricated, could be leveraged to shape perception and ensure survival. Consider the Romanovs. Long before the 1917 revolution, the Russian imperial family was steeped in secrecy. Their private lives, financial dealings, and internal politics were often hidden behind closed doors, carefully curated to maintain the aura of sacred authority. Yet whispers of scandal, the rumored affairs, the alleged corruption, and the opulent indulgences of the aristocracy circulated among the public. These stories could weaken loyalty if mishandled, but the family's careful management of information allowed them to retain a grip on power for centuries. Even in exile, they guarded secrets zealously, knowing that a single leak could undermine their legitimacy or jeopardize their remaining assets. The Habsburgs were masters of both secrecy and spectacle. While publicly displaying grandeur, they simultaneously conducted covert negotiations, marriages, and political maneuvers far from the eyes of the public. Behind closed doors, they arranged alliances, brokered claims to distant thrones, and managed rivalries that could span generations. A scandal involving a morganatic marriage, a hidden child, or a political betrayal could be devastating if exposed. Yet carefully contained, it served to strengthen family bonds and ensure loyalty. In this way, secrecy became a form of power, the ability to control what others could know and, by extension, what they could do. The British royal family, though surviving into the modern era, is no stranger to secrets. From the hidden relationships of the Windsor household to discreet diplomatic interventions, the monarchy has long understood the value of controlling information. Scandals, real or rumored, have often been contained or carefully guided to preserve public perception, demonstrating a mastery of narrative that ensures influence even when direct political power is limited. The very existence of private wealth, estates, and alliances functions as a hidden infrastructure supporting their authority. Exiled dynasties relied on secrecy in even more critical ways. Letters, legal documents, and financial records were often hidden in trusted hands, sometimes for decades, to prevent governments or rivals from claiming their possessions. The Romanovs and Habsburgs alike moved jewels, gold, and art across borders, concealed in ways that seemed almost invisible. These clandestine operations ensured that, even without crowns, dynasties could maintain a measure of control and a readiness to reclaim influence if circumstances changed. Scandals, too, could be wielded strategically. A carefully leaked affair or rumor could destabilize rivals, weaken opposition factions, or reinforce loyalty within the family. In some cases, dynasties orchestrated events so that the public saw only a controlled narrative, ensuring that any potential damage served a long-term purpose. The power of perception was as important as the power of action. Controlling what was known allowed dynasties to operate with near impunity behind the scenes. Consider the Bourbon family. During periods of exile, they faced political and personal challenges that could have destroyed the dynasty's reputation. Yet by carefully managing their image, through selective disclosure, discreet marriages, and cultivated patronage, they maintained the appearance of legitimacy. Scandals were minimized or spun to reinforce the dynasty's moral and cultural authority. In this way, even crises became tools for shaping perception and consolidating power. Secrecy extended to the management of heirs and succession. Dynasties often concealed children, illegitimate lines, or potential claimants to prevent internal disputes or external interference. The Habsburgs, for example, maintained detailed records and private agreements regarding inheritance and succession, ensuring that the integrity of the bloodline remained intact. Protecting these secrets was essential, as any exposure could ignite political claims, disputes, or even wars. This interplay between secrecy and scandal demonstrates a fundamental truth. Dynasties understood that visibility is a double-edged sword. Public grandeur inspires loyalty, but exposure of private failings can destroy authority. By mastering both elements, families could preserve the illusion of perfection while operating strategically in the shadows. Scandals, real or staged, were not merely hazards. They were instruments of control, tools to shape perception, and mechanisms to reinforce power. Even today, the principle persists. Modern royal families manage the delicate balance between public scrutiny and private control. Media attention, public expectations, and global communication make secrecy more challenging than ever. Yet dynasties continue to navigate these pressures with remarkable skill. Carefully managed narratives, discreet alliances, and control over financial and cultural assets ensure that the influence of bloodlines endures. Ultimately, the hidden kings of Europe survived not only because of wealth, blood, or titles, but because they understood the subtle arts of secrecy and perception. Scandals could be threats or tools. Secrets could be vulnerabilities or fortresses. By mastering both, dynasties turned potential disasters into instruments of power, creating a legacy that endures even when crowns are gone. And as these secrets accumulate across generations, they form the invisible architecture of dynastic survival. The hidden currents of influence that flow beneath the surface of history, shaping politics, culture, and society without ever being fully seen. These currents connect directly to the next dimension of endurance: intelligence networks and informants, the unseen eyes and ears that allowed hidden kings to navigate a world that often sought their erasure. For dynasties, survival has never relied solely on crowns, wealth, or bloodlines. Behind the glittering facade of palaces and ceremonies, hidden kings operated through an invisible network of eyes and ears, intelligence systems that spanned borders and generations. In exile, these networks became essential lifelines, providing information about political shifts, potential threats, and opportunities for influence. Monarchs who mastered intelligence and espionage could act decisively while remaining hidden, turning knowledge into a weapon more potent than armies or treaties. The Habsburgs, for example, maintained intricate networks across Europe, gathering information on rival powers, monitoring revolutionary movements, and ensuring their agents were present at critical courts. These networks were often disguised as harmless correspondence, trade dealings, or cultural exchanges. But behind every letter and shipment lay intelligence, ensuring that the dynasty remained informed and connected despite being formally powerless. Knowledge became survival. Ignorance could be fatal. The Romanovs also understood the value of covert networks. Even after their fall in 1917, exiled family members kept tabs on political developments in Russia, monitoring the Bolsheviks, sympathetic monarchists, and foreign governments. Trusted advisors, couriers, and sympathetic diplomats acted as intermediaries, carrying letters, instructions, and sometimes even funds. These channels allowed the Romanovs to influence events from afar, preserving the possibility of restoration and safeguarding their remaining assets. Intelligence networks were not merely political, they were also personal. Dynasties relied on informants to protect family members, monitor internal disputes, and maintain cohesion. Trusted confidants would observe the movements of relatives, ensure heirs were properly educated and positioned, and detect potential betrayals before they could unfold. In many cases, the most critical intelligence was domestic, knowing who could be trusted, who posed a risk, and who might inadvertently expose a secret. Even in modern Europe, the principle remains relevant. While monarchs no longer wield armies in secret, they continue to rely on advisors, diplomatic channels, and private intelligence to navigate international affairs. The British royal family, for instance, maintains a network of aides, advisors, and diplomatic contacts who provide insight into political developments, international relations, and public sentiment. While not espionage in the traditional sense, it reflects the enduring need for informed decision-making and strategic awareness. The methods employed by dynasties were diverse. Some relied on formal diplomacy and trusted ambassadors. Others cultivated merchants, scholars, or clergy as sources of information. In certain cases, espionage extended into clandestine operations, with agents infiltrating rival courts or reporting on revolutionary movements. The goal was always the same: to retain the capacity to act, influence outcomes, and protect the dynasty's interests even when direct power was lost. Secrecy was crucial. Information had to flow selectively, ensuring that allies were informed while enemies remained unaware. A misstep could result in confiscated assets, exposed plots, or even assassination. Dynasties perfected the art of compartmentalization. Intelligence networks operated in cells, with each agent knowing only what was necessary. In this way, even if one part of the network was compromised, the broader system remained intact, preserving both security and influence. Intelligence also intersected with alliances and marriages. Through careful monitoring, Dynasties could identify ideal partners, anticipate political shifts, and negotiate marriages that would strengthen the web of bloodlines. Knowledge of rival plans, economic conditions, or cultural trends allowed exile monarchs to act strategically, securing alliances that ensured long-term survival. In this sense, intelligence was not merely defensive. It was a proactive tool for shaping the future. The interplay between wealth, secrecy, and intelligence created a resilient triad. Resources funded networks, secrets protected operations, and information-guided strategy. Together, these elements allowed dynasties to endure upheavals, revolutions, and wars. Monarchs who mastered this triad could survive centuries of political turmoil, often outlasting governments that sought to erase their influence. The hidden kings of Europe became less about visible rule and more about invisible mastery. Yet intelligence networks were also human enterprises dependent on loyalty, skill, and discretion. A single betrayal or misstep could unravel years of careful planning. Dynasties had to cultivate trust, train successors in the art of discretion, and maintain constant vigilance. This relentless focus on information management became as essential as maintaining palaces or preserving bloodlines. Knowledge, after all, is power, but only if it is protected, analyzed, and acted upon wisely. The legacy of these networks persists today. While the tools have evolved, communications, digital monitoring, and global media now complement traditional methods. The principle remains unchanged. Dynasties survive not just by who they are, but by what they know. Hidden kings are masters of intelligence, using information as both shield and sword, ensuring that even when crowns are absent, influence remains absolute. The mastery of intelligence leads naturally into another aspect of dynastic endurance: diplomacy. Beyond covert networks and personal intrigue, dynasties leveraged formal and informal diplomacy to shape nations, broker peace, and maintain relevance. Their skills in negotiation and statecraft, often honed in exile, ensured that even without a throne, they remained indispensable players on Europe's stage. Even without crowns or armies, dynasties understood that influence depended on relationships, carefully cultivated, strategically maintained, and sometimes quietly enforced across generations. Diplomacy became both a shield and a sword, allowing exile monarchs to preserve their status, broker deals, and shape political outcomes without directly wielding power. In this sense, diplomacy was not simply a matter of protocol. It was a tool of survival, one that ensured dynasties remained relevant even when the thrones they once occupied were gone. The Habsburgs exemplify this approach. After losing formal authority in Austria and Hungary, members of the family continued to act as intermediaries in European disputes. Through letters, marriages, and discreet negotiations, they influenced decisions in courts from Vienna to Madrid. Diplomacy allowed them to maintain a presence in European politics, ensuring that their opinions carried weight despite the absence of a crown. Even in exile, the Habsburgs remained a respected force, often consulted by rulers and statesmen who recognized the family's historical authority and enduring network. Alliances were central to this strategy. Dynasties did not merely forge relationships with reigning monarchs. They cultivated ties with influential families, military leaders, and financial powerhouses. These alliances allowed exiled dynasties to act indirectly, shaping events in ways that served their long-term interests. A well-placed marriage could create a bond that endured for generations, linking families across borders and strengthening the web of influence that supported hidden kings. The Romanovs, after fleeing Russia, relied heavily on diplomatic channels. They maintained correspondence with sympathetic European rulers, engaged with monarchist organizations, and sought support from governments that might aid their restoration. Even without military force, they influenced the balance of power by leveraging personal relationships, financial resources, and the weight of their historical legitimacy. Their diplomacy was subtle but persistent, a reminder that influence does not always require a throne to be effective. Religion often intersected with diplomacy. Popes, bishops, and religious institutions served as mediators, conduits, and allies for dynasties navigating exile. Through church networks, exile monarchs could negotiate with governments, arrange marriages, and protect interests that might otherwise have been vulnerable. In many cases, religious diplomacy enhanced legitimacy, giving hidden kings a moral and spiritual dimension to their political maneuvering. Scandals and intelligence also played a role in diplomatic strategy. By controlling information and managing perception, dynasties could negotiate from a position of strength, leveraging secrets or carefully timed revelations to influence outcomes. A well-timed disclosure, discreet support, or strategic withholding of information could tilt negotiations in favor of an exiled family, demonstrating the interconnectedness of secrecy, intelligence, and diplomacy. Even minor dynasties employed these techniques. Italian princely families, small German duchies, and Scandinavian houses, though limited in direct power, used alliances and diplomacy to maintain relevance. They became intermediaries, cultural patrons, and network hubs, ensuring that even without large armies or vast territories, they could influence regional politics and preserve their dynastic interests. Modern monarchies continue to employ these skills, albeit in a transformed political landscape. Soft diplomacy, ceremonial visits, charitable initiatives, and cultural exchange allows contemporary dynasties to shape international relations subtly. While the stakes are no longer survival and exile, the principle remains. Influence often flows through relationships, networks, and alliances rather than through direct power alone. In essence, diplomacy and alliances provided hidden kings with a lifeline. While crowns could be seized, armies defeated, and territories lost, the ability to negotiate, form strategic relationships, and maintain alliances ensured that dynasties remained vital players on Europe's stage. Even in exile, they could act, maneuver, and preserve their legacy. The mastery of diplomacy leads directly into another dimension of dynastic survival: adaptation. To endure through centuries of upheaval, hidden kings had to reinvent themselves, align with changing times, and anticipate shifts in power, ensuring that their influence could survive even the most radical transformations in European society. Survival for Europe's hidden kings has never been static. Thrones rise and fall, wars reshape borders, and revolutions sweep away centuries of tradition. Yet, dynasties endure not through stubborn attachment to lost power, but through the ability to adapt, politically, socially, and culturally. This adaptability is what distinguishes those who vanish from history from those whose influence quietly persists, shaping nations from the shadows. The Habsburgs provide a striking example. After the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the dynasty faced not only the loss of territory, but also the dissolution of centuries-old social hierarchies. Rather than fading into irrelevance, they adapted by integrating into new political realities, maintaining influence through marriages, financial networks, and cultural patronage. They redefined their identity from sovereign rulers to symbolic leaders and cultural custodians, ensuring their legacy endured in an altered Europe. Similarly, the Romanovs faced cataclysmic upheaval after the Russian Revolution. With the empire dissolved and their family in exile, survival depended on flexibility. They engaged with foreign powers, preserved cultural traditions abroad, and adapted to new social environments while maintaining the mystique of imperial authority. Romanov descendants embraced philanthropy, literature, and diplomacy as ways to continue their family's influence without relying on a throne. In doing so, they transformed tragedy into a platform for enduring relevance. Adaptation also involved redefining the role of monarchy itself. In France, the Bourbons and Orleans branch learned to navigate republican governments by emphasizing ceremonial, cultural, and charitable functions. Though stripped of formal power, they leveraged their historical prestige to maintain social influence, demonstrating that relevance could be sustained through visibility, patronage, and symbolic authority rather than political control. Religion, once central to dynastic legitimacy, became another area of adaptation. Monarchies that once relied on the church for divine sanction adjusted to secularizing societies by integrating faith into broader cultural narratives. By sponsoring charitable initiatives, educational institutions, and religious ceremonies, exiled or diminished dynasties preserved moral authority while navigating societies increasingly distant from traditional religious hierarchies. Even smaller dynasties demonstrated remarkable flexibility. Italian princely families, Scandinavian houses, and minor German duchies, though lacking large territories, survived by aligning with emerging powers, embracing economic opportunities, and participating in cultural life. Adaptation was not about retaining absolute control, but about recognizing shifts in power and repositioning themselves accordingly. This required both foresight and a willingness to compromise without abandoning core identity. Education and social engagement became critical tools. Dynastic heirs were trained not only in traditional statecraft, but also in modern skills, languages, finance, diplomacy, and international relations, enabling them to operate effectively in exile or under diminished authority. By blending historical prestige with contemporary competence, dynasties ensured that their descendants could navigate complex social and political landscapes, retaining influence even when direct rule was impossible. Cultural patronage served as both adaptation and preservation. Dynasties sponsored the arts, funded historic preservation, and promoted education, embedding their legacy within the social fabric. Through these efforts, they transformed influence from a matter of coercion or law into a matter of cultural resonance, ensuring that their presence remained felt long after the last crown had been lost. Adaptation also demanded resilience in the face of changing political ideologies. Monarchies confronted republicanism, socialism, nationalism, and secularism, forces that often sought to erase dynastic influence. By learning to operate within, rather than against, these systems, hidden kings could protect assets, maintain networks, and subtly shape policy. Flexibility became a matter of survival, as rigid adherence to old norms would have led to extinction. The modern British monarchy illustrates the culmination of this adaptive approach. By embracing media, philanthropy, and public engagement, the House of Windsor has preserved relevance in an era of democracy, global communication, and scrutiny. They have maintained ceremonial authority while shaping national identity and soft power on the world stage, demonstrating that adaptation is not merely a historical necessity, but a continuous process. Ultimately, adaptation through centuries reveals a crucial truth. Dynasties endure not because they cling to old power, but because they anticipate change, embrace new realities, and transform threats into opportunities. They survive revolutions, wars, and social upheavals by remaining agile, leveraging every available resource: wealth, blood, religion, intelligence, and diplomacy to navigate shifting landscapes. This capacity for adaptation leads naturally into another vital dimension of dynastic endurance: legacy. Beyond survival in the immediate sense, hidden kings have always been concerned with how their story is told, remembered, and mythologized, ensuring that their influence extends across generations, even when the world believes their power is gone. The endurance of Europe's hidden kings depends not only on survival, but on the stories they leave behind. Legacy and myth have been as vital to dynasties as crowns, wealth, and alliances. By shaping how they are remembered, by cultivating legends, and by embedding themselves in cultural memory, dynasties ensure that their influence extends far beyond political power, sometimes long after the last throne has fallen. From the Habsburgs to the Romanovs, dynasties understood that history is written not just by victors, but by those who control narrative. Portraits, literature, religious iconography, and historical chronicles all played a role in crafting a public image that emphasized legitimacy, valor, and divine favor. Every coronation, every marriage, and every state ceremony was carefully documented, producing a legacy that could be invoked to reinforce claims, inspire loyalty, or assert moral authority. Consider the Romanovs' use of martyrdom in shaping their legacy. The execution of Tsar Nicholas II and his family in 1918 could have marked the end of their story. Instead, the narrative of their suffering and sanctity became a powerful tool. Canonized by the Russian Orthodox Church, the Romanovs were transformed from dethroned rulers into symbols of faith and moral righteousness. This myth preserved their memory, inspired supporters, and reinforced the idea that the dynasty's bloodline carried both historical and spiritual significance. The Habsburgs also cultivated myth. Centuries of rule over diverse European territories allowed them to weave themselves into the cultural, religious, and political fabric of the continent. Legends of their victories, strategic marriages, and even personal virtues circulated widely, reinforcing the aura of legitimacy. Even in exile, these stories served as reminders that the dynasty had been central to European history and, implicitly, that it retained the right to influence events despite political setbacks. Bourbon France demonstrates another dimension of myth-making, the intertwining of romance and tragedy. Exiled monarchs were often depicted as heroic figures in the face of revolutionary upheaval, embodying ideals of honor, sacrifice, and divine right. Literature, music, and visual arts amplified these stories, transforming political defeats into enduring narratives of nobility and resilience. Through myth, dynasties could preserve identity and inspire loyalty, even among populations increasingly distant from monarchical rule. Legacy also depends on secrecy and selective revelation. Hidden dynasties often controlled what was known about their history, emphasizing triumphs while minimizing failures. Letters, memoirs, and archival documents were curated to shape perception, ensuring that future generations would inherit a carefully constructed image. Even scandals or controversial events could be reframed, used to enhance mystique, or buried to preserve the integrity of the family's narrative. Cultural patronage has been another powerful tool in crafting legacy. Dynasties commissioned art, architecture, literature, and music that immortalized their values, achievements, and status. Palaces, cathedrals, and public monuments became physical embodiments of their story, visible reminders that even if political power faded, their influence remained tangible. These cultural markers ensured that dynasties remained central to collective memory, shaping not only historical understanding, but also national identity. Myth-making extended to genealogy and bloodlines. Dynasties carefully documented lineage, emphasizing connections to other noble families, legendary ancestors, and even semi-mythical figures. These genealogies were more than records. They were instruments of legitimacy, reinforcing claims to authority and creating a sense of inevitability around the dynasty's continued relevance. Bloodlines were portrayed as carriers of destiny, embedding the family's significance into the very fabric of European history. In modern times, the crafting of legacy continues through media, public relations, and selective exposure. The British monarchy, for example, manages its image through controlled visibility, charitable initiatives, and symbolic engagement, reinforcing continuity and authority in an era of global scrutiny. Dynasties have learned that in the contemporary world, perception is as critical as reality, and a carefully managed legacy can sustain influence without formal power. Legends also inspire loyalty and devotion, bridging the gap between historical authority and modern relevance. Stories of courage, sacrifice, and moral integrity resonate with the public, creating a connection that transcends politics. In this way, dynasties ensure that their identity, values, and claims endure, not merely as historical footnotes, but as living symbols in culture, religion, and collective imagination. Ultimately, legacy and myth transform dynasties into enduring forces. They allow hidden kings to survive not only political upheaval, but also the erosion of time, embedding themselves into memory, culture, and identity. Through stories, symbols, and carefully curated history, dynasties ensure that even when crowns are absent, their influence remains tangible, shaping perceptions and events long into the future. The cultivation of legacy naturally leads into the final layers of intrigue: conspiracy, speculation, and the modern mystery surrounding Europe's hidden bloodlines. The next section explores how myths, secrecy, and historical gaps have fueled theories that these dynasties still exert power today, often in ways invisible to the public eye. Even centuries after their political power waned, Europe's hidden dynasties continue to stir imagination, speculation, and conspiracy. The very secrecy that once protected them now fuels modern myths, whispered rumors, mysterious connections, and shadowy influence that suggest these bloodlines have never truly relinquished power. Today, the line between history and legend blurs, as hidden kings appear not only in archives, but in stories of secret councils, elite networks, and unseen hand in global events. One of the most persistent myths involves the Habsburgs. Though dethroned after World War I, conspiracy theorists argue that their descendants quietly shape European politics, often through financial institutions, cultural foundations, and secret advisory roles. Wealth and historical prestige become tools of subtle influence, and a mystery surrounding their movements fuels speculation. Observers note that where Habsburg descendants appear at international gatherings, negotiations, or philanthropic ventures, their presence carries symbolic weight, leading some to suggest a deliberate, hidden orchestration of events. The Romanovs, too, are a fertile ground for speculation. Beyond the tragic end of Tsar Nicholas II and his immediate family, rumors persist about hidden heirs, secret lines of succession, and clandestine influence in European and Russian politics. Some theories posit that surviving branches of the Romanov family manipulate financial and political networks in exile, guiding decisions from behind the scenes. While many of these claims are unverified, the combination of historical tragedy, secrecy, and surviving networks makes the idea plausible enough to capture public fascination. Even smaller dynasties feed into the modern mythos. Exiled Bourbon branches, obscure German princely families, and minor Italian houses are sometimes portrayed as guardians of secret wealth or covert alliances, orchestrating influence in ways invisible to ordinary citizens. These narratives often blend fact and conjecture, but they reveal the enduring perception that bloodlines carry authority beyond legal or political recognition. The fascination is not only historical, but psychological. The idea that hidden kings continue to wield unseen power appeals to a sense of mystery, destiny, and the unknown. Media and popular culture have amplified these myths. Books, documentaries, and podcasts frequently explore hidden dynasties, framing them as puppet masters of European history. While these stories often take liberties with facts, they reflect enduring public curiosity and the compelling notion that the real power in Europe may reside not in parliaments or governments, but in the hidden corridors of hereditary influence. The interplay of secrecy, wealth, and historical legitimacy provides fertile ground for speculation. Some modern myths even extend to global politics. Theories suggest that dynastic descendants maintain ties with international financial institutions, multinational corporations, or cultural organizations, subtly steering decisions that affect nations. While concrete evidence is scarce, the enduring networks, historical alliances, and transnational marriages of European dynasties make these claims plausible enough to intrigue researchers and enthusiasts alike. Wealth, discretion, and prestige become the invisible levers of influence, allowing bloodlines to shape events from afar. Secrecy is key to sustaining these myths. Hidden kings and their descendants often maintain private lives that resist public scrutiny, fueling speculation. Carefully curated appearances, limited media access, and discreet philanthropy reinforce the perception that something significant lies just beneath the surface. Where transparency exists, it is measured and strategic, reinforcing both legitimacy and mystery. In this way, modern dynasties continue the centuries-old practice of operating behind the scenes while allowing myth to enhance their aura. Scandals, rumors, and historical gaps provide the narrative tension that fuels conspiracy. Ambiguous letters, disputed inheritance claims, and secret marriages are often cited as proof of clandestine influence. These elements, combined with the real historical power of dynasties, create an environment where myth, legend, and fact intersect. Even skeptics acknowledge that the combination of wealth, intelligence networks, and family connections can allow former monarchs to exert influence in subtle but real ways. Modern myths also serve a psychological function. They provide a sense that history is not merely the record of public events, but a web of hidden forces where legacies, bloodlines, and secrets shape reality. This narrative resonates deeply because it suggests continuity, mystery, and order beneath the apparent chaos of modern governance. Hidden kings, in this sense, represent both the persistence of tradition and the allure of the unknown. Ultimately, these myths reflect a deeper truth. The influence of dynasties does not vanish simply because crowns are gone. Through wealth, networks, intelligence, and carefully curated public perception, hidden kings have found ways to endure. While conspiracy theories may exaggerate their power, the persistence of these narratives reveals that European bloodlines continue to capture imagination and, in subtle ways, shape events. The enduring mystique of hidden dynasties leads naturally to the next exploration, the human element. Beyond politics, wealth, and myth, dynasties survive through the courage, ambition, and resilience of the individuals who embody them. A story of human stakes intertwined with destiny, intrigue, and survival. Behind the grandeur, secrecy, and power of Europe's hidden dynasties lies a deeply human story. Survival was never guaranteed by birthright alone. It depended on courage, ambition, resilience, and sometimes sheer luck. The endurance of these bloodlines is as much about the individuals who embodied them, their choices, sacrifices, and determination, as it is about wealth, intelligence, or alliances. Without human agency, dynasties, no matter how privileged, would have faded into obscurity. The Romanovs offer a stark illustration of personal courage and sacrifice. During the Russian Revolution, members of the imperial family faced unimaginable danger, yet many acted with a sense of duty and loyalty to one another and to their legacy. While the world saw their fate as tragic, their decisions, from attempting to preserve family wealth to managing escape plans, reflected determination and foresight. Even in exile, surviving Romanovs navigated foreign lands, maintained dignity, and worked tirelessly to safeguard their name and cultural heritage. Their story is a reminder that human courage underpins dynastic survival. Similarly, the Habsburgs exemplified resilience in adversity. When empires crumbled and revolutions threatened their existence, individual family members adapted to exile, forging new lives while upholding family identity. They engaged in diplomacy, cultural patronage, and philanthropic work, often balancing personal safety against the broader needs of the dynasty. These choices were not simply strategic. They demanded emotional fortitude, creativity, and unwavering commitment to the continuity of centuries-old legacy. Ambition also played a crucial role. Dynastic heirs had to envision possibilities beyond immediate loss or danger, imagining how their bloodlines could endure and influence the future. Ambition drove them to cultivate intelligence networks, arrange strategic marriages, and maintain connections with powerful allies. It fueled adaptability and innovation, allowing dynasties to navigate centuries of political, social, and economic upheaval while remaining relevant. Without ambition, even immense wealth or noble blood could not guarantee survival. The human element extends to relationships within the family. Loyalty, mentorship, and shared purpose reinforced resilience. Younger generations are trained in the skills necessary to survive exile, manage assets, and uphold the family's reputation. Elders provided guidance, instilled values, and emphasized the importance of discretion and strategy. In this way, Dynasties survived not merely through inherited privilege, but through the careful cultivation of human capability and character across generations. Even failure, in many cases, became a lesson that strengthened dynasties. The exiled Bourbons, for instance, endured political defeats and revolutions, yet each setback provided knowledge, experience, and insight. These experiences informed future strategies, helping heirs navigate complex political and social landscapes. The capacity to learn from adversity, adapt, and persist is a uniquely human element that has sustained dynasties across centuries. Emotional resilience was equally vital. Exile, loss, and public scrutiny imposed psychological burdens that could have easily fractured a family. Yet many dynasties cultivated inner strength, maintaining composure and strategic focus under pressure. The ability to endure personal hardship while pursuing long-term survival reflects a profound human dimension of dynastic endurance, one that is often invisible in public records but central to the continuation of bloodlines. Ambition and courage also intersected with morality and ethical dilemmas. Dynasties often faced difficult decisions: whom to trust, which alliances to prioritize, and how to balance personal safety against collective responsibility. These choices required wisdom, foresight, and moral clarity, and their outcomes could determine whether a dynasty survived or vanished. In this sense, the human element is inseparable from the broader narrative of power and survival. It is the heartbeat of dynastic continuity. In modern times, the human element remains crucial. Contemporary royal families navigate public scrutiny, media pressure, and social change, requiring resilience, diplomacy, and judgment. Their survival depends not only on wealth and legacy, but on personal character, adaptability, and the ability to embody both tradition and modernity. The human choices made today will shape the perception and influence of dynasties for generations to come. Ultimately, the human element reveals the hidden kings of Europe not as static figures in history books, but as living actors in an ongoing drama of ambition, courage, and survival. Their stories remind us that behind every dynasty lies the enduring power of human agency, the capacity to confront adversity, make strategic choices, and ensure that bloodlines continue, even when crowns have long disappeared. This exploration of human resilience naturally leads into the penultimate dimension of the narrative, the emotional climax. We now examine how the hidden kings of Europe, through centuries of secrecy, intelligence, diplomacy, and personal courage, converge to reveal the enduring mystery of their influence and the profound lessons their survival imparts. After centuries of upheaval, exile, and secrecy, the hidden kings of Europe converge in a story that is as much about human endurance as it is about power. Here, the intricate web of wealth, bloodlines, intelligence, diplomacy, adaptation, and courage reaches a crescendo, revealing not only how dynasties survived, but why their legacy continues to echo through history and modern life. This is the moment where the personal and the political, the visible and the hidden, intertwine in a dramatic, almost cinematic revelation of enduring influence. Imagine the halls of a European palace centuries ago, where whispers of strategy mingled with the rustle of silk gowns. Letters moved across borders, secret alliances were forged, and intelligence networks reported on every potential threat. Every decision carried immense weight. A single misstep could mean exile, death, or the dissolution of centuries of legacy. Within these walls, courage, ambition, and resilience were not optional. They were the lifeblood of survival. This emotional reality is often lost in textbooks, yet it is at the core of the dynasty's endurance. The human stakes were profound. Fathers and mothers made impossible decisions for the sake of survival, balancing the immediate safety of their children against long-term dynastic strategy. Heirs learned the art of discretion, loyalty, and negotiation from a young age, knowing that their future and the continuation of centuries of history depended on mastering these skills. Every marriage, alliance, and diplomatic engagement carried the weight of generations, creating pressure that is almost unimaginable today. Yet they persisted. They endured. They adapted. Consider the Romanovs, whose tragic fate in 1918 symbolizes both vulnerability and resilience. Even in the face of annihilation, members of the family and their loyal networks sought to preserve legacy and influence. Some fled to foreign lands, carrying not only physical treasures but also cultural and historical memory. Others worked quietly to maintain intelligence networks, document history, and ensure the survival of their bloodline. Their story captures the emotional intensity of dynastic endurance. Hope, loss, courage, and persistence intertwined in a high-stakes drama spanning continents. The Habsburgs, too, exemplify this emotional intensity. Exiled from power, yet never from purpose, they navigated a shifting Europe with an acute awareness of danger and opportunity. Each alliance, each negotiation, each strategic marriage was a calculated risk, a gambit to ensure that centuries of accumulated influence would not vanish. The weight of responsibility, carried with dignity and intelligence, created an emotional gravity that shaped every decision and, by extension, the course of European history. Diplomacy, intelligence, and secrecy all merge here into a single, powerful narrative. Dynasties relied on the careful orchestration of information, managing what was known and hidden, guiding events from the shadows. Wealth enabled these networks. Alliances expanded them. Secrecy protected them. Yet it is the human element, courage, foresight, and moral clarity, that animates these mechanisms, transforming strategy into enduring survival. Without the personal determination of individuals, even the most sophisticated systems would have collapsed under pressure. Adaptation throughout centuries adds another layer of emotional resonance. Dynasties who survived revolutions, wars, and political upheaval demonstrated remarkable resilience. They reinvented themselves culturally, socially, and politically, maintaining relevance despite the collapse of thrones and the rise of new ideologies. This adaptability was not merely pragmatic. It was deeply human, requiring creativity, courage, and emotional fortitude to embrace change while preserving identity. The myths and legends that dynasties cultivated amplify the emotional power of their stories. They transformed tragedy into heroism, exile into moral triumph, and secrecy into intrigue. Romanovs as martyrs, Habsburgs as enduring mediators, Bourbons as romanticized exiles. Each narrative reflects the emotional stakes of survival and the deep resonance of human courage in the face of overwhelming odds. These myths allow us to connect emotionally with events that may otherwise seem distant or abstract, bridging centuries through storytelling. In modern times, this emotional resonance persists. Descendants of Europe's hidden kings navigate public scrutiny, media pressure, and global attention, balancing personal life with the weight of historical legacy. Their choices in philanthropy, diplomacy, and public engagement continue to reflect the centuries-old principles of discretion, intelligence, and strategy. The emotional thread linking past to present highlights the continuity of human courage and determination in sustaining influence, even without formal power. The climax of this narrative is not a single event, but a cumulative revelation. Hidden kings endure because they master the convergence of human agency and structural advantage. Wealth, intelligence, alliances, adaptation, secrecy, and legacy intersect with ambition, courage, and resilience to produce a force that transcends the visible structures of power. The emotional truth is profound. Dynasties survive not simply because of birthright, but because of the extraordinary human capacity to navigate adversity, shape history, and preserve identity across centuries. This culmination leads naturally into the final section, where reflection and revelation take center stage. We consider the enduring mysteries, the lessons of survival, and the subtle but undeniable ways in which hidden kings continue to influence our world today. The story closes not with the finality of history, but with an invitation to contemplate the ongoing presence of these dynasties, a quiet yet powerful reminder that some legacies are never truly lost. As the centuries unfold and the thrones of Europe shift, the story of hidden kings comes full circle. From the glittering courts of the Habsburgs to the tragic fate of the Romanovs, these dynasties have endured not through sheer luck, but through an intricate blend of wealth, intelligence, secrecy, diplomacy, adaptation, and human courage. Their influence may no longer be overt, but it persists in subtle, often invisible ways, shaping culture, society, and even global perceptions. The ending is not a conclusion of disappearance, but a revelation of enduring presence. Reflection begins with understanding the interplay between myth and reality. Dynasties have always crafted their own narratives, emphasizing triumphs, obscuring failures, and cultivating legends that reinforce legitimacy. These myths are not mere stories. They are instruments of survival. They shape how history remembers them, how societies perceive authority, and how their bloodlines continue to wield influence, often beyond the reach of law or politics. In contemplating this, one realizes that history itself is a mosaic of visible events and hidden forces, with dynasties operating in the spaces between. The endurance of these bloodlines highlights a profound human truth. Survival requires more than inheritance. It demands adaptability, foresight, courage, and a willingness to navigate complexity with patience and subtlety. Hidden kings survived revolutions, wars, exiles, and betrayals because individuals within these dynasties demonstrated extraordinary human agency. Each decision, each calculated risk, and each act of loyalty contributed to a chain of survival stretching across centuries. This human dimension transforms historical analysis into a narrative of emotion, strategy, and resilience. Modern Europe, with its republics, democracies, and media scrutiny, might seem a world far removed from the secretive corridors of exiled dynasties. Yet the principles that ensured survival in the past remain relevant. Wealth, intelligence, alliances, and careful management of perception continue to sustain influence, even without crowns. Modern royal families, cultural patrons, and historical heirs embody the same strategies, translating centuries of tradition into contemporary relevance. The hidden kings are, in essence, still present, not as rulers of nations, but as architects of legacy, culture, and subtle power. Reflection also leads to an emotional understanding of these dynasties' impact. The personal sacrifices, resilience in exile, and courage under pressure evoke empathy and admiration. The lives of individuals, their choices, struggles, and ambitions illuminate the broader historical narrative, reminding us that history is not merely the record of kings and wars, but the story of human determination woven through extraordinary circumstances. This perspective deepens our appreciation for the complex forces that shape societies, revealing the invisible currents of influence that continue to flow beneath the surface. Mystery is an enduring element of this reflection. The secrecy and intrigue that once protected dynasties now fuel fascination, speculation, and myth. Hidden wealth, obscure alliances, and subtle influence generate questions that history cannot fully answer. What if undiscovered letters or hidden heirs still shape political decisions? What if the legacy of these bloodlines quietly informs culture, finance, or diplomacy? While definitive answers are elusive, the possibility itself reinforces the enduring mystique of Europe's hidden kings. Finally, the conclusion invites contemplation. History is not only what is seen, but what is preserved, hidden, and remembered. The hidden kings teach us that influence is not limited to overt authority. It resides in networks, perception, resilience, and human ingenuity. They remind us that the past is alive, threaded through the present in ways both visible and invisible, and that the legacy of courage, strategy, and adaptation continues to echo in modern life. Their story is both a cautionary tale and a celebration of human capability. As viewers reflect on this journey, the subtle call to thought emerges. What if these hidden dynasties have shaped more of our world than we realize? Every cultural institution, every alliance, every historical narrative may bear traces of influence that are invisible yet enduring. The hidden kings of Europe are not just relics of the past. They are living reminders of the enduring power of legacy, human agency, and the intricate dance between secrecy and survival. In the end, the story closes not with a finality, but with an invitation to look beyond the obvious, to consider the invisible threads of history, and to recognize that some legacies are never truly lost. The hidden kings endure, not only in bloodlines, but in the shaping of culture, perception, and the mysteries that continue to captivate our imagination. As the screen fades, the audience is left with both awe and curiosity, pondering the invisible hand of dynasties that have quietly ruled Europe for centuries, and perhaps still do today. The narrative of hidden kings concludes here, but their story, like history itself, continues, unfolding in whispers, myths, and the subtle currents of influence that persist across time. What we have witnessed is not merely the past, but a living tapestry of human resilience, strategy, and enduring power, inviting us to consider how history, secrecy, and ambition intersect to shape the world we inherit.